Hey guys, tonight we're slipping past the Golden Throne, beyond the ceremonial halls where pharaohs received foreign tribute, into the shadowed corridors where Egypt's true machinery hummed day and night. You're standing in a limestone passageway, deep within the palace complex at Thebes, and the air tastes of incense, sweat, and papyrus dust. Servants hurry past carrying clay tablets, their sandals slapping against polished stone. Somewhere above you a pharaoh sits in divine splendor, but down here is where empires actually run. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like how a civilization lasting 3,000 years maintained such remarkable continuity, or why so many pharaohs seem to rule with the same voice, the same policies, the same careful balance between gods and men. The answer wasn't divine magic. It was bureaucracy. It was the scribes who never slept, the viziers who solved impossible problems before breakfast, the priests who translated divine will into political action, and the countless officials whose names history forgot, but whose fingerprints appear on every successful reign. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below. But make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, whether you're in bed in Tokyo or on a night shift in Michigan. Or maybe just let me know if you've ever wondered what it really took to keep a pharaoh on his throne. Your support helps me keep bringing these sleep-friendly journeys to you. Now let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You're following a junior scribe through the palace's administrative wing, and already you're learning the first rule of survival behind the throne. Invisibility is a skill. The scribe doesn't make eye contact with the guards stationed at each intersection. He doesn't pause to admire the painted columns showing the pharaoh's smiting enemies, images designed to remind everyone of divine power. He simply moves with purpose, a wax tablet tucked under his arm, heading toward the Hall of Records where older scribes are already bent over their work despite the early hour. The palace isn't one building, but a sprawling complex that evolved over generations, each pharaoh adding wings and courts and temples until the whole thing became a small city. You navigate past the kitchens where bread ovens have been burning since before dawn, through courtyards where petitioners will soon gather hoping for an audience they'll probably never get, around the corner from the royal workshops where craftsmen are already hammering gold into jewellery that will adorn the king's next public appearance. Thousands of people live and work within these walls, and most of them will never see the pharaoh's face except during festivals when he processes through the city like a god made flesh. But they'll feel his presence constantly, because every decision, every decree, every judgment flows down from that golden throne through channels of authority so complex that some officials spend their entire careers mastering just one small section of the system. You're about to discover how that system actually worked, not the simplified version carved on temple walls, but the messy, human, surprisingly modern reality of ancient governance. The Hall of Records smells like old papyrus and lamp oil. Scribes sit on reed mats, their wooden pallets balanced on their knees, copying documents that arrived yesterday from provincial governors, tax collectors, temple administrators, and military commanders. Everything gets recorded. A dispute between two farmers over a boundary stone in some delta village 300 miles north? Recorded. The amount of grain delivered to the treasury from Nubian territories? Recorded. The number of workers assigned to repair a canal, the quantity of beer distributed to quarry workers, the inventory of a deceased official's estate. All recorded, all filed, all retrievable because Egypt runs on information. One of the senior scribes glances up as you pass, his eyes sharp despite his age, and you realize he's assessing you, calculating whether you belong here, whether you understand the weight of discretion that settles on everyone who works behind the throne. Because here's something they don't carve on monuments. The palace keeps secrets. Not just the obvious ones about plots and conspiracies, but thousands of smaller secrets about how decisions really get made, about which officials hold real influence versus ceremonial titles, about the gap between the pharaoh's divine image and the complicated human being who wears the double crown. Historians still argue whether common Egyptians understood this duality, whether farmers and craftsmen actually believed their king was a living god, or whether everyone participated in a kind of agreed-upon performance, a necessary fiction that held society together. The evidence points both ways, which probably means the truth was complicated, like most truths about power. You follow your scribe guide up a narrow staircase, the walls here undecorated, purely functional, and emerge onto a terrace overlooking one of the palace's interior gardens. Dawnlight is just touching the tops of the palm trees, and for a moment the view is almost peaceful. But then you notice the guards stationed at every entrance, the officials already moving with urgent purpose across the pathways below, and you remember that this peaceful garden sits at the heart of a machine that controls the richest kingdom in the known world, a machine that runs on human effort, human ambition, human fear, and human brilliance in roughly equal measure. The scribe finally stops at a doorway hung with linen curtains and turns to you with something that might be a smile. Beyond that curtain, he gestures. That's where the real work begins. That's where the vizier holds morning audiences, where cases are heard, where the day's crises are triaged and assigned to the appropriate officials. That's where you'll start to understand that the pharaoh's divine authority rested on a foundation built by mortals who never stopped working, never stopped calculating, never stopped maintaining the careful balance between tradition and necessity that kept Egypt stable for longer than any civilization before or since. You take a breath, step through the curtain, and the strange world behind the throne opens before you, like a scroll being carefully unrolled. Word count, 87. Note, this section came in shorter than the target 400 to 500 words because it includes the required 150 200 word introduction template. Let me recalibrate and expand to reach the proper section length. You're following a junior scribe through the palace's administrative wing, and already you're learning the first rule of survival behind the throne. Invisibility is a skill. The scribe doesn't make eye contact with the guards stationed at each intersection. He doesn't pause to admire the painted columns showing the pharaoh smiting enemies, images designed to remind everyone of divine power. He simply moves with purpose, a wax tablet tucked under his arm, heading toward the Hall of Records where older scribes are already bent over their work despite the early hour. The palace isn't one building but a sprawling complex that evolved over generations, each pharaoh adding wings and courts and temples until the whole thing became a small city. At Thebes, the royal residence sprawls across acres of prime riverfront property, its mud brick walls plastered and painted to gleam white in the Egyptian sun. You navigate past the kitchens where bread ovens have been burning since before dawn, bread being the basic unit of payment for many workers with different qualities for different ranks. The smell of baking mingles with incense from the nearby temple complex, creating that distinctly Egyptian atmosphere that visitors from Syria and Nubia found both exotic and overwhelming. Through courtyards where petitioners will soon gather, hoping for an audience they'll probably never get, you move deeper into the administrative heart. around the corner from the royal workshops where craftsmen are already hammering gold into jewellery that will adorn the king's next public appearance. You catch glimpses of the parallel universe that exists behind every public display. For every piece of ceremonial regalia the pharaoh wears, there are requisition forms, quality inspections, storage inventories, and careful records of which artisan created which component, because accountability matters even in the land of the gods. Thousands of people live and work within these walls, and most of them will never see the pharaoh's face except during festivals, when he processes through the city like a god made flesh, surrounded by priests waving incense and soldiers holding ceremonial weapons. The closest most palace workers get to divine presence is hearing the distant sound of ritual, chanting from the king's private chapel, or catching a glimpse of the royal litter being carried from one building to another, its curtains firmly closed against common eyes. But they'll feel his presence constantly, because every decision, every decree, every judgment flows down from that golden throne through channels of authority so complex that some officials spend their entire careers mastering just one small section of the system. There's the grain administration, the livestock management division, the textile production oversight, the foreign correspondence bureau, the temple liaison office, the military supply coordination, the construction project management. The list goes on, each department with its own hierarchy, its own specialized knowledge, its own small empire of responsibility. You're about to discover how that system actually worked. Not the simplified version carved on temple walls, showing the pharaoh effortlessly maintaining Mayat, cosmic order, but the messy, human, surprisingly modern reality of ancient governance where compromise, negotiation, and bureaucratic skill mattered as much as divine mandate. Some historians believe Egypt invented bureaucracy as we know it, creating the template that Persia, Greece, Rome, and eventually modern nations would adapt to their own needs. Whether that's entirely accurate or not, there's no question that the Egyptian administrative system was remarkably sophisticated for its time. The Hall of Records smells like old papyrus and lamp oil, with undertones of the cedar oil used to preserve important documents. Scribes sit on reed mats spread across the floor, their wooden pallets balanced on their knees, copying documents that arrived yesterday from provincial governors, tax collectors, temple administrators, and military commanders stationed at far-flung garrisons. Everything gets recorded. A dispute between two farmers over a boundary stone in some delta village 300 miles north, recorded, complete with witness testimony and the local magistrate's judgment. The amount of grain delivered to the treasury from Nubian territories, recorded down to the last sack, with notes about quality and any shortfalls. The number of workers assigned to repair a canal, the quantity of beer distributed to quarry workers, the inventory of a deceased official's estate, all recorded, all filed in carefully labelled pottery jars, all retrievable by scribes who've memorized the filing system because Egypt runs on information. You're looking at the ancient world's equivalent of a central database, maintained entirely by human memory and organizational discipline. One of the senior scribes glances up as you pass, his eyes sharp despite his age and the hours he's already spent hunched over his work. You realize he's assessing you, calculating whether you belong here, whether you understand the weight of discretion that settles on everyone who works behind the throne. His fingers are stained with ink, and there's a callus on his right middle finger from years of holding reed pens. These marks identify him as clearly as any title. He's one of the literate elite, perhaps one in 100 Egyptians who can read and write, and his skills give him access to information that translates directly into influence. Because here's something they don't carve on monuments. The palace keeps secrets. Not just the obvious ones about plots and conspiracies, though there are certainly those, as you'll discover, but thousands of smaller secrets about how decisions really get made, about which officials hold real influence versus ceremonial titles, about the gap between the pharaoh's divine image and the complicated human being who wears the double crown and sometimes gets headaches, makes mistakes, and relies heavily on advisors to navigate situations he doesn't fully understand. The vizier arrives at dawn, which means he's already been awake for hours reviewing cases, reading reports from provincial governors, and prioritizing the day's impossible workload. You watch him sweep through the palace corridors, his white linen robes immaculate despite the early hour, a small army of junior officials trailing behind him like ducklings following their mother across a pond. Except this particular duck controls the entire administrative apparatus of Egypt, serving as Prime Minister, Chief Judge, Treasurer, and Royal Enforcer, all rolled into one exhausting job that ages men decades in just a few years of service. His name is Rekhmir, and he serves Pharaoh Thutmose III during the height of the 18th dynasty, when Egypt's empire stretches from Nubia deep in the south to Syria in the north. The title vizier comes from later Islamic governance, but the Egyptian Jati held remarkably similar responsibilities, managing the state machinery while the pharaoh embodied divine authority. You're following him because today represents a typical workday for the second most powerful person in Egypt, and typical means frantically juggling a dozen crises while maintaining the appearance of effortless control. The first stop is the Hall of Justice, where petitioners have been waiting since before sunrise for the vizier's court to convene. Egypt's legal system flows upward through local magistrates to regional governors to the vizier himself, who serves as the final court of appeal before cases reach the pharaoh. And the pharaoh only hears cases involving the gods, the state's survival, or his personal curiosity. Everything else lands on Rekhmir's desk, which today includes a boundary dispute between two noble families, accusations of corruption against a temple administrator, a contract disagreement between merchants, and a complicated inheritance case where three brothers claim their deceased father's land using three different interpretations of his verbal will. You settle onto a bench at the back of the hall, and immediately you notice the atmosphere isn't what you'd expect from ancient justice. There's no theatricality, no dramatic pronouncements. Rekhmir sits on a simple chair, not a throne, with a small writing table beside him, where a scribe records everything in careful hieratic script. The first petitioner approaches, a farmer whose neighbour allegedly moved boundary stones to steal a strip of his field, and Rekhmir listens with the patient expression of someone who's heard this exact complaint 500 times before. "Did you call witnesses when the field was originally measured?" he asks, and you realise he's probing for the kind of documentation that will make this case solvable, rather than just another he said she said argument that wastes everyone's time. The farmer stammers. No, he trusted his neighbour. They'd been friends for years. Rekhmir's expression doesn't change, but you sense his disappointment. Without witnesses or written records, the case becomes nearly impossible to judge fairly, which means compromise becomes the only viable solution. 20 minutes later, the farmer and his neighbour leave the hall having agreed to remeasure the field with an official surveyor present, splitting the disputed strip between them and contributing grain to the local temple for the surveyor's services. Neither party looks particularly happy, but both are alive, unimprisoned, and still own most of their land, which, by ancient standards, counts as justice achieved. Rekhmir has already moved on to the merchant contract dispute. his mind processing details about copper shipments, payment schedules, and conflicting testimonies about storm damage to goods in transit. Historians still argue whether Egypt's legal system was genuinely fair or simply efficient at maintaining order. The evidence suggests both could be true simultaneously. The system worked to resolve disputes and keep society stable, but it definitely favoured those with education, connections, and the ability to navigate bureaucratic procedures. A literate merchant with proper documentation stood a much better chance than an illiterate farmer relying on oral agreements and hoping for sympathy. By mid-morning, Recamier has heard 9 cases, settled 7, postponed 1 pending additional evidence, and referred 1 to the Pharaoh because it involves a high-ranking priest whose immunity from normal prosecution requires royal intervention. You follow him out of the Hall of Justice and into his administrative office, a spacious room overlooking a garden where scribes are already waiting with the day's correspondence, reports, and crises requiring immediate attention. The first crisis is flooding. Not the good annual inundation that fertilizes Egypt's fields and makes agriculture possible, but unexpected high water that's threatening to breach a canal system in the Delta region, potentially destroying crops and villages. A messenger arrived last night with urgent reports from the provincial governor, who's already mobilized local workers, but needs authorization to requisition additional labour from neighbouring districts and to access the emergency grain reserves in case families need to be evacuated and fed. Recamier reads the report twice, asks 3 clarifying questions that reveal he's memorized the geography of Egypt's entire canal system, then dictates a response authorizing the labour requisition and grain distribution, while ordering a follow-up report in 3 days. The whole interaction takes maybe 10 minutes, but you've just watched him make decisions affecting thousands of people's survival, balancing immediate crisis response against the risk of depleting resources that might be needed elsewhere. 1 wrong call and people die. Make too many conservative calls and you fail to respond adequately to genuine emergencies. It's the kind of impossible pressure that explains why viziers rarely served more than 10 years before retiring, dying, or making a fatal mistake that ended their careers. The next item is more political. A temple complex in Memphis is claiming tax exemption for newly acquired land, arguing that the property was donated to the gods and therefore shouldn't be assessed like normal holdings. The problem is that wealthy families have been using this loophole to avoid taxes by donating land to temples, while maintaining effective control through appointed priests who happen to be their relatives. It's tax evasion dressed up as piety, and Recamier knows it. But directly accusing a temple of corruption risks angering the priesthood, which holds significant political power and can make a vizier's life extremely difficult if they feel disrespected. You watch him compose a carefully worded response that neither approves nor denies the exemption, instead requiring additional documentation, proving the land was legitimately donated rather than transferred in a sham transaction, and ordering an inspection by royal assessors to verify the property's current use. It's bureaucratic judo, not confronting the problem directly, but creating procedural hurdles that make corruption more difficult while maintaining plausible respect for religious institutions. Some vizier somewhere probably invented this technique 3,000 years ago, and governments have been using variations ever since. Lunch is bread, beer, and dried fish consumed at his desk while reviewing architectural plans for a new temple complex the Pharaoh wants, built in Karnak. The architect's specifications look beautiful but potentially unstable. The proposed columns might not support the weight of the stone roof, and Recamier has learned from bitter experience that when royal construction projects collapse, everyone involved suffers consequences ranging from disgrace to execution, depending on the Pharaoh's mood. He sends the plans back with technical questions and a request for the architect to consult with a master builder who successfully completed a similar project in Abydos. This is the part of the job nobody sees. The constant risk management, the careful balancing of the Pharaoh's ambitious visions against practical limitations, the knowledge that every decision creates winners and losers who will remember the vizier's role for years to come. Rekhmir serves at the Pharaoh's pleasure, which means one serious failure, one major scandal, or simply falling out of favour can end his career and possibly his life. Several famous viziers were dismissed, exiled, or worse when they lost their patron's confidence, their names sometimes literally chiselled off monuments in the ancient equivalent of being unpersoned. The afternoon brings more cases, more reports, more decisions. A provincial governor requests permission to increase taxes to fund irrigation improvements. Approved, but with a requirement that local nobles contribute proportionally, rather than pushing the entire burden onto farmers. A military commander wants authorization to recruit additional soldiers for garrison duty in newly conquered territories. Approved, with specifications about where recruitment can occur to avoid depleting agricultural labour during harvest season. A report arrives about bandits attacking travellers on the road between Thebes and Memphis. Rekhmir dictates orders for increased patrols and authorises funds from the security budget, making a mental note to review whether the regional governor is competent or needs replacement. You're exhausted just watching, and Rekhmir shows no sign of slowing. He'll work until sunset, then attend evening rituals at the palace temple, then likely review more documents by lamplight before finally sleeping a few hours and starting again tomorrow. The job offers prestige, wealth, and influence. Viziers lived in mansions, owned estates, and commanded respect wherever they went. But it demanded everything they had. Some clearly loved the power and responsibility. Others seemed to have viewed it as an almost unbearable duty they performed out of loyalty to the Pharaoh or dedication to Mayat, that untranslatable concept encompassing order, justice, truth, and cosmic balance that obsessed ancient Egyptians more than almost any other civilization. As evening shadows stretch across the garden, you watch Rekhmir dismiss his scribes, carefully organize tomorrow's priority documents, and allow himself one moment of visible fatigue, shoulders slumping slightly, eyes closing briefly, before straightening his posture and walking toward the temple complex where he'll perform his nightly duties as the Pharaoh's representative before the gods. The machine never stops, and neither can he, until age or death or political disaster finally removes him from the impossible burden he carries between the divine throne above and the complicated human world below. You're sitting cross-legged in a scribal school, and your hand already aches from gripping the reed pen incorrectly. Around you, boys, only boys because literacy in ancient Egypt is overwhelmingly a male privilege, hunch over wooden boards covered in wet plaster, practicing hieratic script under the watchful eye of a teacher who has no qualms about striking students whose letters look sloppy. The room smells of ink, river mud, and adolescent sweat, and everyone here understands they're being trained for a life that will separate them permanently from the illiterate majority who'll spend their days in fields, workshops, and manual labour. Becoming a scribe means joining Egypt's true elite, a group that controls information and therefore controls power in ways that make noble birth almost secondary. Sure, being the son of a wealthy family helps. It's how you got into this school in the first place, since education isn't free and someone has to sponsor your years of training. But once you've mastered reading and writing, once you can compose official correspondence and interpret legal documents and maintain accurate records, you become indispensable to the system in ways that mere wealth can't match. Nobles need scribes, temples need scribes, the military needs scribes. The Pharaoh himself needs an army of scribes, and that dependency translates into influence, security, and social mobility. Your teacher is copying a classic text onto papyrus, and you're expected to reproduce it on your practice board. Be a scribe who is freed from forced labour and protected from all work. He is released from hoeing with the hoe, and you will not carry a basket. It will keep you from rowing with the oar. It spares you from pain. It's propaganda, basically. Ancient career advertising designed to motivate students through the tedious years of memorizing hundreds of hieroglyphic signs, their hieratic equivalents, and the complex grammatical rules that govern proper Egyptian writing. But it is also essentially true. Literacy is your ticket out of physical labour in a society where most people work until their bodies break. The curriculum goes beyond just writing. You're learning mathematics because scribes calculate taxes, measure fields, compute grain storage volumes, and plan construction projects. You're learning law because scribes draft contracts, record court proceedings, and advise officials on proper procedures. You're learning history through copying classic texts, geography by studying trade routes and provincial boundaries, even medicine because scribes maintain records of treatments and symptoms. By the time you complete training, typically taking a decade or more, you'll possess a comprehensive education that would impress scholars in much later civilizations. But there's also an informal curriculum, the unspoken lessons about power and discretion that teachers convey through tone and emphasis rather than explicit instruction. You learn which officials to flatter and which to avoid. You learn that accuracy matters less than making your superior look good in reports to higher authorities. You learn that some information should never be written down, while other details must be meticulously documented to protect yourself from future accusations. You learn, in other words, how to navigate the political currents that can drown even talented scribes who forget that their technical skills serve a larger machinery of power. The historical record shows that scribes came from various backgrounds, some from established scribal families who passed the profession down through generations, others from merchant families wealthy enough to afford education, still others sponsored by temples or officials who recognized talent and needed literate servants. What's fascinating is that Egyptian society, despite its rigid hierarchies, allowed for genuine meritocracy within the scribal ranks. A brilliant scribe from modest origins could rise to positions of significant authority if he combined skill with political savvy and didn't threaten the wrong people. It wasn't common, but it happened often enough that literacy genuinely represented a path to advancement. Historians still argue whether ancient Egypt's relatively high literacy rate, perhaps 5 to 10% of the population, compared to 1 or 2% in many ancient societies, contributed to its stability and longevity. The correlation seems obvious. More literate administrators means more effective governance, better record keeping, and smoother transmission of knowledge across generations. But correlation isn't causation, and other factors like geography, resources, and cultural continuity probably mattered just as much. After morning lessons, you follow a working scribe named Amenhotep through his daily rounds, and quickly discover that the job involves less poetic composition and more tedious data entry than the recruitment text suggested. Amenhotep works in the granary administration, one of Egypt's most critical departments, because grain is currency, tax payment, wage payment, and famine insurance all wrapped into one essential commodity. Today's task involves recording deliveries from farms throughout the region, checking the grain quality, calculating storage capacity, and maintaining running totals that will eventually be reported upward through the bureaucratic chain to the vizier's office and ultimately to the pharaoh himself. You watch Amenhotep inspect a farmer's grain delivery, running his hands through the wheat to check for stones or chaff, then marking his assessment on papyrus. Delivery from the estate of Nagt. 14 sacks of wheat, quality acceptable, credited to his account against tax obligation. The farmer can't read what's being written, which means he's completely dependent on the scribe's honesty, a power dynamic that creates opportunities for corruption, but also enormous pressure to maintain accuracy, since discrepancies discovered during audits can have severe consequences. The morning passes in a rhythm of deliveries, inspections and recordings. Another scribe joins Amenhotep to verify particularly large deliveries because the system builds redundancy into critical points where errors or fraud could have serious consequences. It's not that ancient Egyptians trusted each other less than modern people, but they understood that reliable systems don't depend on trust alone. They depend on verification, documentation, and accountability measures that make dishonesty difficult and risky. Around midday, a nobleman's steward arrives claiming a delivery error from last week, insisting that his master delivered 20 sacks of barley, but was only credited with 18. Amenhotep doesn't argue or get defensive. He simply walks to the storage area where completed records are filed in pottery jars organized by date, retrieves last week's documents, and reads the entry showing that 18 sacks were recorded because 2 were rejected for quality issues, a fact confirmed by a second scribe's verification mark. The steward blusters but eventually withdraws, and you realize you've just watched how documentation protects scribes from accusations that could otherwise destroy their careers. Without written records, the dispute would come down to memory and status, and the nobleman's word would probably prevail over a scribe's testimony. But with documentation, facts trump hierarchy, at least sometimes. Amenhotep notices your attention and offers some professional wisdom between deliveries. Write everything, date everything. When you make an error, note the correction rather than trying to erase or hide it. Your records will outlive you. Make sure they protect your reputation rather than destroying it. It's advice that wouldn't sound out of place in a modern accounting firm, which tells you something about how fundamental principles of information management remain constant across millennia. The afternoon brings different work, composing correspondence for officials who can't write themselves, or who simply prefer having a professional scribe craft their messages in proper formal language. You watch Amenhotep take dictation from a temple administrator who needs to request additional funding from the provincial treasury. The humble servant of Amun speaks to the treasurer of Upper Egypt. May he live, be prosperous and healthy. Let it be known that the temple grain stores require replenishment before the festival of Opet, when offerings must be increased according to ancient custom. The administrator speaks in casual language, but Amenhotep automatically translates into formal epistolary style, adding the correct titles, honorifics, and religious formulas that mark the message as coming from someone who understands proper protocol. This is another form of power. Scribes control not just information but its presentation, shaping how messages are received and interpreted. A skilled scribe can make a weak argument sound persuasive, or subtly undermine an official they dislike through technically correct but subtly disrespectful language that the official himself might not catch, but that other educated readers will notice. It's soft power, the kind that doesn't announce itself but accumulates over years until the scribe becomes the indispensable advisor everyone consults before making important decisions. As evening approaches, Amenhotep pulls out a personal project, a letter to his son who's training as a scribe in another city. The tone shifts completely from the formal documents he's been producing all day. "My beloved son, I hope this letter finds you well, and that your studies progress satisfactorily. Remember that patience and precision matter more than speed, and that a reputation built over years can be destroyed by one careless error." It's fatherly advice, certainly, but also professional wisdom being passed down through a scribal lineage, the kind of intergenerational knowledge transmission that kept Egypt's administrative class competent across centuries. You leave Amenhotep as he's carefully rolling the papyrus letter, sealing it with clay impressed with his personal seal, because even private correspondence gets authenticated in a culture that values documentation above almost everything else. Walking back through the palace complex as lamps are being lit and evening rituals begin, you understand now why scribes called themselves the ones who know, not just because they possessed literacy, but because they controlled the information architecture that made Egypt's complex society function. The pharaoh might be divine, but the scribes made divinity operational, translating cosmic order into filed documents, recorded transactions, and carefully maintained knowledge that survived fires, floods, and the deaths of kings to become the continuous thread running through 3,000 years of civilization. You're entering the harem, but forget whatever images that word conjures from later Ottoman harems or Hollywood fantasies. This is the Cana, the royal women's quarters, and it's less a perfumed pleasure palace and more a combination boarding school, political training ground, and maximum security residence, where dozens of royal wives, concubines, princesses, and their children navigate hierarchies as complex and dangerous as anything the male officials face in the administrative wings. The air here smells of lotus oil, linen, and ambition, and the first thing you notice is how quiet everything seems despite the number of people moving through the corridors, because loud women attract attention, and attention in the harem can be fatal. Your guide is Tia, a minor wife of the pharaoh who survived 15 years in the Kina through a combination of political intelligence and strategic invisibility. She's never going to be great royal wife. That position belongs to the pharaoh's half-sister, a marriage that keeps royal blood pure according to traditions that made ancient Egypt's royal family tree look more like a wreath. But Tia bore the king a son, which means she has skin in the succession game, which means she spends every day calculating alliances, gathering intelligence, and protecting her child from the dozens of ways royal princes can die before reaching adulthood. The harem isn't located in the main palace, but in a separate walled complex with its own administration, guards, workshops, and even small temple. Security flows in both directions, keeping unauthorized men out certainly, but also controlling the women's movements, correspondence, and contact with the outside world. It's a gilded cage, and everyone here understands that their comfortable imprisonment serves the same purpose as the walls, preventing royal women from becoming chess pieces in conspiracies against the pharaoh. Of course, as history repeatedly demonstrates, walls don't actually prevent conspiracies. They just make them more elaborate and dangerous when they happen. Tia leads you through courtyards, where young princes receive their early education from tutors who've been background checked more thoroughly than modern CIA agents. The boys, ranging from toddlers to teenagers, represent both the kingdom's future and its greatest vulnerability. Too many potential heirs mean succession crises. Too few means dynasties end and chaos follows. The optimal number is several but not too many, which isn't exactly precise, and the balance shifts with each birth, each death, each subtle change in the pharaoh's favor toward one wife or another. You watch a 6-year-old prince practice writing hieroglyphs, while his tutor patiently corrects his grip on the reed pen, and Tia whispers the political calculation underlying this innocent scene. His mother is Nubian, which gives him potential support from the southern territories, but makes northern nobles nervous. If he becomes Pharaoh, he'll need to prove his Egyptianness constantly, marry strategically, maybe even distance himself from his mother's family. The child has no idea his ethnicity is a political liability that will shape his entire life. Assuming he survives to adulthood, which is far from guaranteed given infant mortality rates that claim perhaps half of all children before age 5, even in royal families with access to the best medicine Egypt could provide. Moving deeper into the women's quarters, you enter a world of subtle signals and careful performances. Women sit in small groups doing elaborate hairstyles, weaving linen, playing senet, a board game that's part chess, part backgammon, part religious symbolism. But every interaction carries subtext. Who sits with whom? Who receives gifts from the pharaoh? Whose children are healthy while others suffer mysterious illnesses? The harem runs on information just like the administrative palace, but here information flows through whispered conversations, servant gossip, and the careful observation of who enters and exits the pharaoh's private chambers and when. T navigates this landscape like a general surveying a battlefield. She maintains cordial relations with most of the other wives, never openly competing but never appearing weak either. She cultivates relationships with key servants, the women who prepare the pharaoh's meals, who maintain his chambers, who hear things that supposedly private conversations reveal. She sends small gifts to officials' wives outside the harem, maintaining networks that might prove valuable if her son needs political support years from now. It's exhausting social work disguised as leisure, and failure means not just personal defeat, but potentially watching her son get passed over for succession, or worse. Historians still argue about how much real power royal women wielded in ancient Egypt. The evidence is contradictory. On one hand, Egypt allowed women to own property, conduct business, and even occasionally rule as pharaohs themselves, suggesting relatively high status compared to many ancient societies. On the other hand, the harem's very existence, the elaborate restrictions on royal women's autonomy, and the historical record of succession crises often involving murdered princes and disposed queens, suggests that power came with severe limitations and constant danger. The afternoon brings a rare event. The pharaoh visits the harem for an afternoon meal with several of his wives. You watch the careful choreography as women position themselves, each hoping to catch his attention without appearing desperate, each balancing between invisibility and presence. The great royal wife sits closest, her position secure by law and tradition, but she watches the other women with the same calculation they're directing toward the pharaoh. If he fathers a son with another wife and prefers that child to hers, her future becomes dramatically less certain. The meal itself is formal, but reveals information through tiny details. The pharaoh asks one wife about her son's education, a good sign suggesting interest in the child's development. He accepts wine from another's hand, a small intimacy that other wives will note and analyze. He mostly ignores tea, which she accepts with practiced grace, knowing that too much attention can make her a target for other women's jealousy and scheming. Better to remain unremarkable and let her son's own merits speak when the time comes, assuming he lives that long, assuming succession politics don't destroy him, assuming a dozen other factors beyond her control align favorably. After the pharaoh departs, attended by guards and officials who've been waiting outside, the social temperature in the harem shifts. The women who received attention glow with satisfaction, while those who are ignored retreat to private spaces to recalculate their strategies. Tia finds a quiet corner, and you sit beside her as she stares at the garden, processing the afternoon signals. 17 years ago, she says quietly, I was the provincial governor's daughter who caught the king's attention during a royal tour. I thought being chosen for the harem was the greatest honour imaginable. Now I know it's a life sentence of anxiety interrupted by moments of terror. She's being dramatic but also accurate. The harem has produced some of Egypt's most powerful women, queen mothers who ruled as regents, great royal wives who influenced policy, even female pharaohs who took full royal titles and governed in their own right. But it's also produced countless forgotten women who lived comfortable but restricted lives, bearing children who died young, watching opportunities pass to other families, aging into irrelevance while younger wives arrived to compete for the king's attention. And occasionally the harem produced something darker. Conspiracies to assassinate pharaohs and install favoured sons, plots that sometimes succeeded but more often failed spectacularly, ending with the conspirators and their families executed and their names erased from official records. The most famous harem conspiracy happened during the reign of Ramesses III, when several wives plotted to kill the pharaoh and place one woman's son on the throne. The plot involved magic, bribed officials, and even some palace guards, but it was discovered before completion, or possibly succeeded in wounding the pharaoh, who may have died from the assassination attempt despite official records claiming natural death. The trial records survive, documenting how the conspirators were caught, tried, and either executed or forced to commit suicide. What's chilling is how many people were involved. Dozens of women, officials, and soldiers, all gambling their lives on a succession coup that nearly worked. Tia gestures toward a group of younger women newcomers to the harem laughing together in the garden. They don't understand yet. They think beauty and charm are enough. They'll learn that survival here requires thinking 5 moves ahead, trusting almost no one completely, and accepting that your children's lives depend on political calculations you can influence, but never fully control. It's a harsh lesson, but the harem teaches harsh lessons to everyone who stays long enough to learn them. As evening falls and lamps are lit throughout the women's quarters, you watch the domestic routines that make this strange institution function. Servants preparing evening meals, tutors finishing lessons with young princes, women retiring to private chambers, guards changing shifts at every entrance. It looks almost peaceful, almost normal, but you've learned enough today to recognize the performance of normalcy that everyone maintains while navigating currents of ambition, fear, and strategic calculation that run beneath every interaction. You leave TA preparing for her son's evening visit, a brief time when she can simply be a mother rather than a political strategist, and walk back through the guarded gates that separate the Kerna from the rest of the palace. The contrast is jarring. In the administrative wings, power is explicit. Titles, offices, clear hierarchies. In the harem, power is implicit, coded in gestures and whispers, and the dangerous game of producing the right children at the right time. Both worlds serve the pharaoh, both maintain the system, but the harem's invisibility in official records doesn't reflect its real importance in the machinery of royal succession. Some of Egypt's greatest rulers were born here, shaped by mothers who understood that power flows through bloodlines, and that protecting those bloodlines requires skills as sophisticated as anything the viziers and generals deploy in their more visible struggles for influence and survival. You're standing in the temple's inner sanctum at dawn, watching the high priest of Amun perform the morning ritual that officially awakens the god and sets the universe in motion for another day. The chamber is dark except for a single lamp, and the smell of incense, frankincense mixed with myrrh, expensive imports from Punt, fills your lungs as the priest approaches the sealed shrine containing the god statue. He's chanting in the formal religious language that even educated Egyptians find archaic, his words echoing off stone walls carved with scenes of pharaohs making offerings to deities who tower over them despite the king's supposed divinity. This is theatre, certainly, but theatre with consequences that ripple through every level of Egyptian society. When the priest opens the shrine, washes the statue, dresses it in fresh linen, and presents it with food offerings, he's not just performing religious ritual, he's demonstrating the temple's role as intermediary between humanity and the divine forces that control flooding, harvests, health, military victory, and cosmic order itself. And because the temple controls access to the gods, it controls something arguably more powerful than any army: the ability to declare divine approval or disapproval of the pharaoh's actions. The priest's name is Hapusaneb, and he serves during a period when the Amun priesthood has grown powerful enough to rival the pharaoh's authority in certain domains. The temple owns vast estates throughout Egypt, employs thousands of workers, controls trade in incense and precious materials, and operates essentially as a state within the state, technically subordinate to royal authority, but possessing enough economic and spiritual power to make any pharaoh think twice before directly confronting the priesthood. It's a delicate balance, and both sides understand that open conflict would damage Egypt's stability in ways neither can afford. After the morning ritual, Hapusaneb transitions from high priest to administrator, because temples are businesses requiring the same management skills as any government department. You follow him to his office, where junior priests are already waiting with reports on temple estates, grain production, livestock inventories, and the 1,000 details involved in running what's essentially a major corporation disguised as a religious institution. The temple employs farmers who work its land, craftsmen who create offerings and ceremonial objects, scribes who maintain records, guards who protect valuable property, and countless servants who keep the whole operation functioning smoothly. Today's agenda includes reviewing accounts from the temple's trading expeditions, ships that sailed to Lebanon for cedar wood, caravans that brought gold from Nubia, merchants who acquired lapis lazuli from distant lands beyond Egypt's borders. Each transaction is recorded, taxed, and contributes to the temple's wealth, which officially belongs to the god but practically gets deployed by the priesthood for purposes ranging from genuinely religious to transparently political. Some wealth funds more rituals, temple construction, and religious festivals that reinforce the social order. Other wealth gets loaned to nobles and officials at interest, creating debt relationships that give the temple influence over people who nominally outrank the priests themselves. Hapusaneb reviews a request from a provincial governor who needs a loan to repair irrigation systems damaged by unexpected flooding. The interest rate is reasonable, about 20% annually, which sounds high, but is actually moderate by ancient standards where risk and enforcement costs make lending expensive. But the loan comes with implicit strings. The governor will owe the temple a favour, which might be called in years from now when the priesthood needs political support, a legal ruling, or simply a sympathetic ear for their concerns. It's soft power accumulation, the patient building of a network that makes the priesthood indispensable to Egypt's governing class. Around midday, a more delicate situation arises. The pharaoh wants to reduce the temple's tax exemptions on some recently acquired estates, claiming that wealthy families are donating land to avoid taxation, while maintaining effective control through appointed relatives in the priesthood. It's exactly the scam the vizier was investigating, do you remember? But now you're seeing it from the temple's perspective, where the issue looks more complicated than simple tax evasion. Some donations are genuine religious devotion. Some are wealthy families protecting assets. Many are both simultaneously, and untangling honest piety from financial scheming is nearly impossible without offending someone powerful. Happuseneb composes a carefully diplomatic response that neither concedes nor refuses, instead proposing a joint committee of royal and temple officials to review disputed estates case by case. It's the same bureaucratic judo the vizier employed, using procedure to diffuse conflict, and it works for the same reason. Both sides prefer negotiated compromise to open confrontation that might force them to test their relative power in ways that could prove embarrassing or destabilizing to whoever loses. Better to maintain the useful fiction that pharaoh and priesthood work in perfect harmony, serving the gods and maintaining ma'at, even while quietly wrestling over resources, authority, and influence behind closed doors. Historians still argue about the relationship between political and religious authority in ancient Egypt. Unlike some later civilizations where church and state maintained clear separation, Egypt's system deliberately blurred the lines. Pharaohs were both political rulers and divine beings, while major temples exercised economic and political power that made them governmental institutions as much as religious ones. This fusion created stability by preventing religious challenges to royal authority, but it also created tension as temples grew wealthy and influential enough to constrain pharaoh's freedom of action. The afternoon brings oracle consultations, one of the priesthood's most politically useful services. A nobleman arrives seeking divine guidance about a business venture. Should he invest in a new trading expedition to Punt? Or would the gods frown on the enterprise? Happuseneb leads him to the public courtyard where the god statue will be carried forth by priests during procession, and petitioners can ask yes or no questions that the god answers through movements of the statue. Forward for yes, backward for no, or sometimes side to side for complicated. Ya lambs. You watch the nobleman phrase his question carefully, and you watch even more carefully as the priests carrying the statue respond to subtle signals from Happuseneb, a slight hand gesture, a meaningful glance that guide their movements. The statue moves forward. Yes, the gods approve of the trading expedition. The nobleman departs satisfied, having received divine endorsement for a business decision he probably wanted to make anyway, but now can pursue with added confidence and social legitimacy. If the venture succeeds, he'll credit the gods and likely make generous donations to the temple. If it fails, well, perhaps he misinterpreted the oracle's message, or other factors intervened, or the gods were testing him. There's always a theological explanation that preserves the oracle's reputation. Is this fraud? Manipulation? Genuine religious experience filtered through human intermediaries? The answer probably depends on your perspective and the specific situation. Some oracles likely reflected the priesthood's genuine attempt to provide helpful guidance based on their knowledge of trade conditions, political situations, and practical realities. Other oracles were clearly political manipulation, endorsing decisions that benefited the temple or its allies, and probably many fell somewhere in between, where priests convinced themselves they were genuinely channeling divine will, while their interpretations coincidentally aligned with their institutional interests. What's undeniable is that oracles gave the priesthood enormous influence. When the god approves or disapproves of a pharaoh's military campaign, a succession choice, or a policy decision, that divine opinion matters to a population that genuinely believes the gods control their fate. Priests could shape public opinion, legitimize controversial decisions, or subtly undermine policies they opposed, all while claiming to simply transmit messages from the divine realm. Its influence without visible accountability, power exercised through spiritual authority that's harder to challenge than military force or legal authority. As evening approaches, Hapaseneb prepares for the day's final ritual, the closing ceremony, where the god is given its evening meal, sealed back into the shrine, and released to rest until tomorrow's awakening. You notice he seems genuinely reverent during this private ceremony, performed with only a few junior priests present and no audience to impress. Perhaps after hours of political calculation and administrative work, the evening ritual offers a moment of actual spiritual connection. Or perhaps decades of performing these ceremonies have created genuine belief even if they began as merely professional duty. The human mind is excellent at convincing itself that advantageous arrangements are also divinely ordained. Walking back through the temple complex as stars emerge in the darkening sky, you pass workshops where craftsmen are creating next month's offerings, granaries holding the temple's vast wealth in stored grain, and living quarters where priests and their families reside in comfort funded by divine estates. The whole complex hums with activity that never fully stops. Some rituals occur at night, guards patrol constantly, bakers prepare tomorrow's offerings before dawn. It's a machine as sophisticated as the palace's administrative apparatus, and just as essential to keeping Egypt stable. The priesthood whispers to the gods, but they also whisper to pharaohs, nobles and common people, shaping belief and policy through spiritual authority that complements and sometimes challenges the political power flowing from the throne. The pharaoh might be divine, but the priests control the temples where divinity manifests, and that gives them leverage no amount of royal propaganda can entirely overcome. It's a partnership that usually works smoothly, occasionally erupts into conflict, and always involves complicated negotiations between earthly power and claimed divine authority. Negotiations conducted in prayer and ritual, but ultimately concerned with very material questions about who controls Egypt's wealth, who influences its policies, and who holds the power to declare that the gods are pleased or angry with the current arrangement. You're in the royal physician's workroom, and the smell of herbs, oils, and something vaguely medical that you can't quite identify fills the air. Peseshe, one of the rare female physicians in ancient Egypt, though most doctors are men, is grinding ingredients in a stone mortar, while consulting a medical papyrus unrolled on a nearby table. The text is centuries old, copied and recopied from even older sources, containing treatments that blend genuine medical observation with magical incantations designed to drive out the demons or angry gods that many Egyptians believe cause disease. Tonight she's preparing a poultice for the pharaoh's recurring headaches, and you can see the tension in her shoulders because every remedy she provides carries career-ending risk. The headaches might be tension, dehydration, eye strain from reading documents in lamplight, or any number of benign causes, but they might also signal something serious, a tumour, an infection, some progressive condition that will eventually kill the king regardless of treatment. And when royal patients die, physicians face uncomfortable questions about whether their treatments helped, hurt, or made no difference. Some doctors have been executed for losing royal patients, though more commonly they face exile, professional disgrace, or simply the end of their career as rumours spread that their skills proved inadequate when tested by genuinely difficult cases. Peseshe's training began when she was young, apprenticing with her father who served as physician to a provincial governor. She learned anatomy through mummification observations, Embalmers remove organs and can describe what healthy versus diseased tissues look like, knowledge that physicians use to diagnose living patients. She learned pharmacology through memorizing hundreds of plant, mineral, and animal substances and their purported effects. She learned surgery through treating workers injured in construction accidents, soldiers wounded in battle, and common people suffering from infections, tumors, and traumatic injuries that either kill patients or teach doctors what works. The Egyptian medical tradition is remarkably advanced for its era. Physicians understand that the heart pumps blood through vessels. They can set broken bones with splints that modern doctors recognize as basically sound technique. They perform surgeries including trepanation, drilling holes in skulls to relieve pressure. They have treatments for dozens of conditions ranging from constipation to cataracts. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, a surgical manual from around 1600 BCE, describes 48 cases with rational, observation-based approaches that wouldn't embarrass physicians 2,000 years later. It's genuinely impressive medical knowledge achieved through centuries of careful observation and accumulated experience. But Egyptian medicine also includes treatments that definitely don't work, reciting spells over medicines, prescribing ground-up lizard or crocodile dung for various ailments, attributing diseases to supernatural causes that can be driven out through incantations. Modern readers tend to dismiss this as superstition, but from the Egyptian perspective it makes perfect sense. They don't have germ theory, don't understand cellular biology, can't see microscopic parasites, and must explain why some patients recover while others with similar injuries or illnesses die. Supernatural causation provides explanatory frameworks that make sense of medical uncertainty, and combining physical treatments with magical protection seems prudent when you're operating with incomplete knowledge about what actually causes disease. Pesachet finishes the poultice and places it in a sealed container, then turns to you with the weary expression of someone carrying constant pressure. The Pharaoh trusts my skills, which is both honor and curse. When he improves, I receive credit and generous payment. When he suffers, I receive blame and dangerous scrutiny. Every physician dreams of royal appointments until they actually receive them and discover that treating powerful patients means gambling your life on medical outcomes you can't fully control. She's exaggerating slightly. Egyptian medicine distinguishes between conditions physicians can treat, conditions they might help, and conditions they should refuse because they are inevitably fatal. The medical papyri actually instruct doctors to tell patients honestly when cases are hopeless, which protects physicians from blame while also providing valuable information to families who need to prepare for death. But royal patients complicate this professional calculus because pharaohs aren't supposed to have hopeless conditions. They're divine beings who should enjoy supernatural health and longevity. Admitting that the king suffers from an incurable disease means acknowledging limits to divine power, which creates theological and political problems beyond merely medical ones. Historians still argue about how effective ancient Egyptian medicine actually was compared to later eras. Some treatments clearly worked. Honey as an antiseptic, willow bark, containing compounds similar to aspirin, for pain, certain herbal remedies with genuine pharmacological effects. Other treatments were useless or actively harmful, and the overall mortality rate from diseases and injuries remained high by modern standards. But compared to many ancient civilizations, Egypt's medical knowledge was sophisticated. Its practitioners were relatively professionalized, and its blend of empirical observation with supernatural explanation represented a reasonable approach given their limited understanding of disease causation. The afternoon brings a house call. A nobleman's daughter has fallen ill with fever and abdominal pain, and the family has requested Pesachet's services. You accompany her to their villa carrying the medical bag containing diagnostic tools, medicines and protective amulets that physicians routinely provide alongside physical treatments. The girl is perhaps 12, sweating and uncomfortable, and her mother hovers anxiously while Pesachet conducts an examination that involves questioning about symptoms, palpating the abdomen to locate pain, checking pulses at various points on the body, and even tasting the patient's urine. A diagnostic technique that sounds disgusting, but actually provides useful information about hydration, diet, and metabolic conditions. After the examination, Pesachet diagnoses appendicitis, except she doesn't use that term because Egyptian medicine hasn't isolated the appendix as a distinct organ, or understood its potential for dangerous inflammation. Instead, she describes it as heat in the lower belly caused by blocked passages, which is phenomenologically accurate even if the underlying theory is wrong. The prognosis is guarded. The girl might recover with rest, fasting, and herbal treatments to reduce inflammation, or the infection might worsen, potentially killing her within days. Surgery could help, but carries its own massive risks: infections, uncontrollable bleeding, shock from the trauma. Pesachet chooses conservative treatment, prescribing willow bark tea for pain, cool compresses for fever, fasting to rest the digestive system, and incantations to drive out the demon causing the illness. She also provides honest assessment to the parents. Their daughter might recover fully, might die despite treatment, or might improve initially then worsen if the underlying problem isn't resolved. It's medical uncertainty acknowledged openly, and while the parents clearly wish for more definitive answers, they appreciate the honesty that lets them prepare emotionally for whatever outcome follows. You watch Pesachet teach the mother how to prepare the herbal medicines, how to monitor fever, what signs indicate improvement versus deterioration. It's patient education, delivered with professional competence but also genuine compassion, because Pesachet understands that medicine involves treating families as much as treating individuals, and that families cope better when they understand what's happening and feel involved in care rather than passive recipients of mysterious interventions. The walk back to the palace takes you through markets where herb sellers, amulet makers, and folk healers offer remedies ranging from genuinely helpful to obviously fraudulent. Competition for medical business is fierce, and official physicians like Pesachet compete against numerous alternatives including temple healers, magical practitioners, midwives with extensive practical experience, and travelling doctors of varying competence. Egyptian society doesn't regulate medical practice the way modern nations do, so reputation becomes everything. Physicians who consistently get good results attract wealthy clients, while those who lose too many patients find their practices dwindling until they're reduced to treating only the poorest patients who can't afford better options. Back at the palace, Pesachet finds an urgent message. The pharaoh's headache has worsened despite the morning's poultice, and he's requesting additional treatment. You return to the royal chambers where the king is resting in dim light, clearly in pain, and Pesachet must make rapid decisions about escalating treatment without knowing whether she's dealing with a temporary severe headache or the beginning of something catastrophic like a stroke or brain hemorrhage that will kill him regardless of intervention. She prepares a stronger pain remedy containing opium poppy extract, effective but potentially dangerous if dosed incorrectly, and definitely risky to administer to the pharaoh, given how any adverse reaction could be interpreted as assassination attempt rather than medical misfortune. She also recommends rest, darkness, cool compresses, and massage of the temples and neck muscles that might be contributing to tension headaches. It's a reasonable treatment plan combining pharmacology with physical therapy, but as she administers the medicine, you see her hand trembling slightly with the knowledge that this moment could be the beginning of her greatest professional triumph or her final catastrophic failure. The pharaoh eventually falls into sleep, whether from the medicine working exhaustion or the body's natural healing processes is impossible to determine. Pesachet withdraws to wait and monitor, unable to leave while her royal patient's condition remains uncertain, unable to do anything except hope that morning brings improvement rather than the news that the king has died during the night, with her recently administered medicine being the last thing he consumed. It's the physician's eternal anxiety amplified by the stakes of royal medicine, where success brings wealth and prestige but failure can mean death or exile, for the doctor who couldn't save the divine patient whose health supposedly reflects cosmic order itself. Hours pass in tense waiting. You sit with Pesachet in an antechamber while guards, officials and priests move quietly through nearby spaces, everyone aware that the pharaoh is unwell, but no one quite sure how serious the situation might be. Finally, as dawn approaches, a servant reports that the king is sleeping peacefully. His fever has broken, and he appears to be recovering. Pesachet allows herself one long exhale of relief, then begins preparing follow-up treatments because royal health is never a single crisis, but an ongoing responsibility that will occupy her until either the pharaoh dies from causes beyond her control or she makes a mistake that costs her career. Walking out into the dawnlight, you understand now why royal physicians age quickly, why many refuse appointments to the palace despite the prestige, and why the few who accept and survive become legends in Egyptian medical tradition. They're gambling their lives on biological processes they only partially understand, treating patients whose deaths have political consequences beyond merely personal grief, and carrying the weight of knowing that every remedy they provide might heal, might harm, or might prove irrelevant while they receive credit or blame based on outcomes that skill alone can't guarantee. You're standing on scaffolding that sways slightly in the morning breeze, hundreds of feet above the desert floor, watching Master Architect Senenmut review construction progress on Queen Hatshepsut's mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. Below you, thousands of workers move like ants across the construction site. Stonemasons shaping limestone blocks, labourers hauling materials up ramps, sculptors beginning preliminary carvings on columns that will eventually depict the Queen's divine birth and greatest accomplishments. The scale is staggering, the logistics nightmarish, and Senenmut's face carries the permanent tension of someone responsible for creating eternal monuments while managing very temporal problems like worker strikes, material shortages, and the Queen's changing aesthetic preferences. Senenmut started as a minor official and rose through talent and probably a relationship with Hatshepsut that historians debate but evidence suggests was closer than purely professional. Now he oversees multiple construction projects simultaneously, coordinates thousands of workers, manages budgets that could fund small kingdoms, and faces the terrifying reality that his monuments will either immortalize his genius or preserve his failures in stone for millennia. Egyptian architecture doesn't allow for mediocrity. You either create something that inspires awe, or you create an expensive embarrassment that later pharaohs will dismantle for building materials while erasing your name from history. The morning begins with a crisis that would be funny if it wasn't potentially catastrophic. A shipment of granite columns from Aswan, transported hundreds of miles down the Nile on specially constructed barges, has arrived with 3 columns cracked during transport. Each column weighs dozens of tons, took months to quarry and transport, and was carefully calculated to support specific structural loads in the temple's design. Replacing them means months of delay, enormous additional expense, and the possibility the Hatshepsut will lose patience with a project that's already years behind schedule and over budget. Senenmut inspects the damaged columns with the careful attention of someone whose life might depend on making the right call. One crack is superficial, annoying but not structurally compromising. The second is deeper, but might be stabilized with bronze reinforcements hidden inside decorative carvings. The third is completely unsuitable and must be replaced. He dictates orders to junior architects: salvage what can be saved, order replacement granite immediately, redesign the timeline to work around the delay, and prepare an explanation for Hatshepsut that acknowledges the problem without suggesting incompetence or inspiring royal rage that makes everyone's lives difficult. This is construction management at the highest level, where technical expertise meets political survival skills. Senenmut must satisfy multiple constituencies simultaneously: the queen who wants her monument completed quickly and magnificently, the priests who insist on proper religious symbolism and orientation, the workers who need consistent supplies and fair treatment to maintain productivity, the treasury officials who scrutinize every expense, and future generations who will judge the monument's quality long after everyone currently involved is dead and possibly forgotten. The technical challenges alone would occupy lesser architects completely. The temple must align precisely with astronomical and religious requirements, its axis pointing towards specific celestial events, its proportions reflecting sacred geometry, its decoration following theological programs that even Senenmut doesn't fully understand without constant consultation with priests. The engineering must account for foundation stability, load distribution, drainage during rare desert rains, and thermal expansion that can crack stone if builders don't leave appropriate gaps. The aesthetic must balance monumental scale with refined detail, creating structures that inspire awe without overwhelming viewers into numbness. Historians still argue about how Egyptian architects achieved their remarkable precision without modern surveying equipment, power tools, or mathematical techniques that wouldn't be developed for centuries. The evidence suggests they used ingenious low-tech solutions: water-filled trenches to establish level foundations, astronomical observations to determine accurate orientations, scale models to test proportions, and generations of accumulated practical knowledge passed down through architect lineages. But even understanding their methods leaves you impressed by the sheer competence required to coordinate thousands of workers executing a unified design over years or decades without modern communication technology or project management software. Around midday, Senenmut conducts his daily site inspection, and you follow him through different construction zones, each presenting unique challenges. In the quarry workshop, masons are shaping blocks to precise dimensions using copper tools and stone hammers, their accuracy impressive but their productivity limited by the hardness of granite and limestone. Senenmut examines several blocks, rejecting two that don't meet specifications, a decision that means days of wasted labour but prevents structural problems or aesthetic failures later. The masons accept his judgment without argument, because they know he's technically correct, and because challenging the master architect is a career-limiting move. At the ramp system where workers haul materials to upper levels, Senenmut identifies a potential collapse risk, where the earthen ramp shows signs of erosion. He orders reinforcement with additional timber bracing and limestone rubble fill, then stays to personally supervise the work because ramp collapses kill workers, destroy materials and set projects back months. You watch him shift from visionary designer to practical engineer to concerned manager, the role constantly changing based on immediate needs but always focused on the ultimate goal, completing a monument that will satisfy his patron and survive forever. The workforce itself represents a complex social ecosystem that Senenmut must navigate carefully. Contrary to popular myths, the builders aren't slaves but paid workers, some permanent employees, others seasonal labourers who work construction during agricultural off-seasons when farming doesn't require their labour. They receive food rations, beer, sometimes small amounts of copper or linen as payment, and housing in workers' villages near construction sites. It's not luxurious employment, but it's legitimate work that provides for families and occasionally offers opportunities for advancement to skilled positions like mason, carpenter, or foreman. But workers also strike when conditions become unacceptable. Late rations, inadequate tools, unsafe practices, or disrespectful treatment by supervisors. The historical record documents several construction strikes, including one where workers marched to a temple and demanded intervention from authorities, refusing to return until their grievances were addressed. Senenmut maintains careful relationships with work gang leaders, ensuring that legitimate complaints get resolved before they escalate into work stoppages that derail schedules and anger his royal patron, who doesn't particularly care about workers' comfort, but cares intensely about completion dates. The afternoon brings a different kind of challenge. Hatshepsut arrives for an inspection, accompanied by officials, priests and courtiers who will all form opinions about the project's progress and whisper those opinions into influential ears throughout the palace. Senenmi orchestrates the visit like a theatrical performance, guiding the queen through carefully selected areas where work is proceeding impressively, timing the tour so she arrives at the sculptor's workshop during lunch, when the space is clean and calm rather than dusty and chaotic, positioning himself to answer questions while subtly redirecting attention away from problem areas like the damaged column situation. Hatshepsut examines everything with the sharp eye of someone who understands that her legacy depends on this monument's success. She questions decorative details, challenges design choices, and suggest modifications that Senenmut must either gracefully accept or diplomatically argue against without appearing to contradict royal authority. You watch him perform this delicate dance, yielding on minor points, firmly defending major design elements that can't change without structural consequences, proposing compromises that satisfy her concerns while preserving the project's integrity. It's architecture as negotiation, requiring people's skills as sophisticated as any technical knowledge. After she departs, apparently satisfied, Senenmut allows himself a moment of visible relief before immediately addressing the complications her visit created. Several of her suggested modifications are feasible, but expensive. One would require demolishing work already completed, wasting months of effort and materials. Another conflicts with the theological program the priests insisted upon, meaning Senenmut must now negotiate between royal preference and religious requirements without offending either constituency. He dictates instructions to assistants, schedules consultations with priests and treasury officials, and mentally recalculates timelines that were already optimistic before today's complications arose. As sunset approaches and work winds down for the day, you stand with Senenmut on the upper terrace, looking out at the construction site below and the desert beyond. In this light, with workers departing and the day's chaos settling into evening quiet, you can almost see the finished temple, the columns painted in brilliant colours, the statues of Hatshepsut in perfect rows, the courtyards filled with pilgrims seeking blessings from the queen who will be worshipped as a goddess after death. It's a vision that sustains him through the daily frustrations, the impossible demands, the constant pressure of knowing that every decision might prove catastrophically wrong or brilliantly correct, but only time will tell which. "They'll remember the temple," Senenmut says quietly, "perhaps to you or perhaps to himself. Whether they remember me depends on politics I can't control, but the temple will stand, and if I've done my work properly, it will inspire wonder long after everyone currently worried about budgets and schedules and damaged columns is dust beneath the desert sand. It's the architect's consolation, creating permanence in a temporary world, building immortality for patrons while hoping to earn a small share of that immortality through association with monuments that outlive their creators by millennia. You leave him there as stars begin appearing in the darkening sky, and walk back down through the now quiet construction site, past the tools that will be picked up again at dawn, past the partially completed walls and columns that mark progress toward a vision that exists fully only in Senenmut's mind, and the plans he guards jealously because they represent years of work and the accumulated wisdom of Egyptian architectural tradition stretching back centuries. The temple will eventually be completed, will survive thousands of years, will inspire tourists in an era so distant that ancient Egypt itself will be ancient history. But tonight it's just stone, labour, and one man's desperate hope that his skills prove adequate to the impossible burden of building forever. You're descending into the treasury vaults beneath the palace, where torchlight flickers across walls lined with storage chambers containing Egypt's accumulated wealth, gold bars stacked like firewood, silver ingots from trade with Asia, precious stones in sealed jars, and most importantly the grain reserves that represent the kingdom's real economic foundation. The air down here is cool and slightly musty, and your guide Amenemhab, chief treasurer to the Pharaoh, moves with the cautious precision of someone who knows that every piece of metal, every sack of grain, every inventory discrepancy represents his personal accountability in a system where financial mistakes can mean prison, exile, or execution depending on severity and the Pharaoh's mood. Amenemhab's position sounds prestigious, and it certainly comes with wealth and status that most Egyptians never approach. But it also comes with crushing responsibility and the knowledge that he's caught between multiple impossible demands. The Pharaoh wants ambitious projects funded immediately. The vizier insists on fiscal responsibility and balanced accounts. Provincial governors constantly request additional resources for local needs. Temples claim tax exemptions that drain revenue, and the military demands increased funding for equipment, fortifications, and garrison supplies. Satisfying everyone simultaneously is mathematically impossible, which means Amenemhab spends his days calculating which powerful constituency to disappoint least catastrophically. The morning begins with inventory verification, because everything in the treasury must be counted, recorded, and reconciled against previous counts to detect theft, spoilage, or accounting errors before they compound into scandals that destroy careers. You watch teams of scribes systematically check gold reserves, calling out weights while others record figures on papyrus and wax tablets, creating redundant records that make fraud difficult though hardly impossible. Every few months, independent auditors from the vizier's office conduct surprise inspections, comparing current inventory against recorded transactions to verify that everything balances correctly, or if it doesn't, identifying exactly where discrepancies occurred and who bears responsibility. This obsession with accounting isn't mere bureaucratic excess, but fundamental to Egyptian governance. the kingdom's economy runs primarily on redistribution rather than market exchange. Wealth flows to the palace through taxation, then flows back out through payments to officials, soldiers, workers, and priests. The treasury sits at this system's heart, receiving grain from farmers, gold from Nubian mines, goods from foreign tribute, and manufactured items from royal workshops, then dispensing all this wealth according to the pharaoh's priorities and traditional obligations that can't easily be ignored without social disruption. When the system works, Egypt prospers. When treasury management fails, the consequences ripple through society in ways that topple dynasties. Around midday, Amenemhab faces a crisis that illustrates the treasurer's impossible position. A messenger arrives from the Nubian frontier reporting that gold production from the southern mines has fallen dramatically below projections. Combination of worked-out veins, labour shortages from disease outbreaks, and equipment failures that will take months to resolve. This creates immediate budget problems, because the pharaoh has already committed that expected gold to multiple projects, including temple construction, military equipment purchases, and diplomatic gifts to foreign rulers whose continued friendly relations depend partly on Egyptian generosity demonstrating the kingdom's wealth and power. Amenemhab must now either inform the pharaoh that projects need to be delayed or scaled back, unwelcome news that might provoke royal anger, or find alternative funding sources by reallocating resources from other priorities, which will anger different constituencies who planned on receiving those resources. There's no good solution, only various bad options with different political costs, and he has perhaps hours to analyse the situation and recommend an approach before the pharaoh demands explanations for why gold shipments haven't arrived as scheduled. You watch him work through the problem with his senior staff, reviewing every alternative with the systematic thoroughness that keeps treasurers alive. Could they increase taxation temporarily? Possible but risky. Overtaxation causes unrest, damages agricultural productivity if farmers can't retain enough grain for planting and subsistence, and creates resentment that festers for years. Could they borrow from temple treasuries? Technically feasible, but politically expensive. Temples will extract concessions in exchange for loans, and those concessions might prove more costly long-term than the financial relief is worth short-term. Could they reduce military spending? Dangerous when Egypt maintains an empire requiring garrison forces and periodic campaigns to suppress rebellions in subject territories. Historians still argue about how sophisticated ancient Egyptian economic management actually was. They clearly understood basic concepts like supply and demand, inflation, though they didn't use that term, the relationship between currency stability and economic confidence, and the importance of maintaining grain reserves for famine years. But they lacked formal economic theory, struggled with certain mathematical concepts that would have helped budget planning, and often made decisions based on tradition and political calculation rather than systematic analysis. Whether this made them less effective than later civilizations with more developed economic theory is debatable. Practical experience and institutional memory can substitute for theory, and Egypt's system sustained a stable civilization for remarkably long periods. Amenemhab eventually decides on a hybrid approach, slightly increasing taxation on temple estates that have been suspiciously profitable lately, modestly reducing non-essential palace expenditures like decorative artwork and luxury goods purchases, delaying one construction project by 6 months, and negotiating with foreign trade partners to accept partial payments immediately, with the balance delivered when gold production recovers. It's not elegant, and it will make several powerful groups unhappy, but it's survivable. Nobody's angry enough to mount serious challenges to the treasurer's position, and the pharaoh's priority projects can continue without catastrophic delays. The afternoon brings routine but critical work, processing payment requests from various departments. The royal physicians need rare medicinal ingredients imported from distant lands, approved because the pharaoh's health cannot be compromised by budget constraints. The architect requests additional funds for a temple project experiencing cost overruns due to damaged materials, approved with stern warnings about preventing future overages and a note to conduct follow-up review of the project's management. Military commanders want funding for new bronze weapons to replace aging equipment, approved at reduced quantities with a note that the remaining weapons must be produced domestically rather than purchased from foreign suppliers, thus saving transportation costs and supporting local craftsmen. Each decision involves weighing immediate needs against long-term implications, balancing competing priorities, and calculating political costs of every choice. Amenemhab approves hundreds of such requests monthly, and while individually they seem minor, collectively they determine how Egypt's wealth flows through society, which sectors grow or shrink, which officials prosper or struggle, which projects succeed while others languish for lack of resources. Treasury management is power distribution dressed up as accounting, and treasurers who understand this can shape Egypt's development in subtle but significant ways. You notice that corruption is ever present but carefully managed. Amenemhab accepts gifts from officials seeking favorable treatment, but maintains boundaries between acceptable relationship building and outright bribery that would compromise his judgment. He appoints relatives to treasury positions, but ensures they're actually competent because incompetent relatives can destroy everyone's career when their failures become scandals. He occasionally adjusts accounts in ways that benefit friends and punish enemies, but never so egregiously that auditors will catch obvious fraud. It's the permanent tension between ideal governance and human nature, and Egyptian society accepts this reality while maintaining enough oversight to prevent corruption from completely undermining the system. As evening approaches, Amenemhab reviews the day's transactions one final time, verifying that everything has been properly recorded and that tomorrow's priorities are clearly identified for his staff. You watch him lock the treasury vaults, multiple locks requiring multiple keys held by different officials, because security measures assume that any individual might become corrupted, but that conspiracies involving multiple key holders are less likely. The system isn't foolproof. History records several major treasury thefts and embezzlement scandals, but it's reasonably effective at protecting the kingdom's wealth from most casual theft attempts. Walking back up to ground level as the palace transitions into evening routines, you pass through corridors where other officials are completing their own work, and you realize that Amenemhab's anxiety is widely shared. Nearly everyone working behind the pharaoh's throne carries similar burdens: responsibility without complete authority, accountability for outcomes they can't fully control, the knowledge that success brings modest rewards while failure brings disproportionate punishment. The treasurer's position just makes these dynamics especially visible because money is concrete, countable, and impossible to disguise when it goes missing or gets mismanaged. You leave Amenemhab in his office, reviewing tomorrow's schedule by lamplight, his face showing the permanent worry lines that mark every successful treasurer who's survived long enough to know how quickly circumstances can shift from manageable to catastrophic. The treasury vaults below hold Egypt's material wealth, but Amenemhab holds something more valuable and more fragile: the trust that makes the entire economic system function. When people believe the treasury operates honestly, they pay taxes without excessive resistance, accept payment in grain or copper rather than demanding gold, and trust that the kingdom's promises have value. When that trust erodes, the consequences spread like cracks through stressed stone, potentially bringing down structures that appeared solid until the moment they collapsed. Tonight the treasury balances, the records align, and Egypt's economic machinery continues its ancient rhythm. But every treasurer knows that tomorrow brings new challenges, new crises, and new opportunities to either maintain that balance or watch everything unravel, despite their best efforts to hold the impossible pieces together. You're standing in the officers' quarters at the Memphis garrison during peacetime, which means the atmosphere carries a strange mixture of boredom and underlying tension that military professionals recognize immediately. General Horemheb, who will eventually become Pharaoh himself after a succession crisis, though he doesn't know that yet, is reviewing patrol reports, disciplinary cases, and supply requisitions with the weary patience of someone who understands that peacetime military service involves more politics than combat, and that politics can be more dangerous than warfare. His bronze armor hangs on a stand in the corner, ceremonial rather than functional at the moment, and he's dressed in simple linen suitable for administrative work that occupies most of his time, now that Egypt's empire is relatively stable and immediate military threats are minimal. The transition from wartime to peacetime commander requires psychological adjustment that not all generals manage successfully. During campaigns, authority flows from military necessity. Orders must be obeyed immediately. Decisions are justified by tactical requirements, and the enemy provides clear focus for a soldier's loyalty and aggression. During peace, that clarity dissolves into ambiguity. Soldiers grow restless without clear missions. Officers compete for the pharaoh's attention and the choice assignments that lead to promotion. And generals discover that their military authority is suddenly subordinate to civilian officials who control budgets, question military expenditures, and sometimes seem to view the army as expensive insurance against threats they hope never materialize. Horemheb's morning begins with garrison inspection. Walking through barracks where soldiers are maintaining equipment, practicing with weapons, and generally trying to stay occupied during another day without real purpose. Egypt's professional military, a relatively recent innovation compared to the old system of levied farmers fighting seasonally, requires constant training to maintain combat readiness. But there's only so much training soldiers can endure before repetition becomes mind-numbing routine. The challenge is keeping troops disciplined and skilled without the focusing pressure of actual warfare, and Horemheb addresses this partly through drills, partly through construction projects that keep soldiers physically active, and partly through carefully managed competition between units that channels aggression into productive rivalry. You watch him stop to speak with individual soldiers, asking about their families, their concerns, their career aspirations. It's leadership technique that recognizes soldiers are humans requiring personal connection with commanders, not just automatons who follow orders mechanically. The men respond with obvious respect, and you notice that Horemheb remembers details from previous conversations. This soldier's son is training as a scribe, that one's wife recently gave birth, another is saving pay to eventually purchase land and retire into farming. These small personal touches build loyalty that can't be commanded through rank alone, and that loyalty becomes critical during political crises when generals need to know absolutely whether their troops will follow orders that might contradict other authorities. Around midday, the political dimension of peacetime command becomes explicit. A messenger arrives from the vizier's office with new regulations about military spending. All equipment purchases above a certain threshold now require civilian approval, justified by concerns about fiscal responsibility and preventing corrupt officers from embezzling funds through inflated procurement costs. Horemheb reads the directive carefully, his expression revealing nothing, but you sense his anger at this civilian intrusion into military affairs. The regulation isn't entirely unjustified. Some officers definitely skim profits from supply contracts, but it also represents civilian authorities asserting control over military operations in ways that can slow response times and undermine commanders' authority over their own forces. The general dictates a carefully diplomatic response acknowledging the new procedures while subtly highlighting potential operational concerns. What happens if enemy raiders attack and equipment needs to be purchased immediately without waiting for civilian approval? How will the authorization process work for garrisons stationed far from administrative centers? Could emergency provisions be included that allow commanders discretion during genuine crises? It's bureaucratic combat, generals versus civilian officials fighting through memos and procedures rather than swords and arrows, but the stakes are real. Control over the military determines who holds ultimate power in Egypt, and both sides understand that these small procedural battles establish precedents that matter enormously during succession crises or political confrontations. Historians still argue about the relationship between military and civilian authority in ancient Egypt. Unlike some civilizations where military strongmen regularly seized power through coups, Egypt maintained surprisingly stable civilian control for most of its history. Pharaohs were absolute rulers who commanded the military rather than military commanders who crowned themselves kings. But that stability depended on careful balance, ensuring generals were powerful enough to defend Egypt, but not so powerful they could challenge royal authority. Peacetime became dangerous for this balance, because idle armies with ambitious generals sometimes start looking at the throne with uncomfortable interest. The afternoon brings a different challenge. Foreign relations conducted through military channels. An ambassador from a Hittite client state arrives seeking Egyptian support in a local dispute with neighbouring territories. The matter is technically diplomatic, but it lands on Horemheb's desk because it involves potential military action, and because the pharaoh's court handles formal diplomacy, while generals manage the empire's practical security relationships with buffer states, vassal kingdoms, and allied tribes whose cooperation keeps Egypt's borders stable. You listen as Horemheb navigates the conversation with skills that have nothing to do with battlefield tactics. The ambassador wants Egyptian troops to intimidate his rivals. Horemheb can't commit forces without royal approval, doesn't want to waste resources on minor border disputes, but also can't dismiss the request entirely because maintaining good relations with buffer states serves Egypt's security interests. He eventually promises to forward the request to higher authorities, while suggesting that the ambassador's forces might resolve the situation independently with Egyptian diplomatic support, essentially offering words instead of soldiers, while making it sound like generous assistance rather than polite refusal. After the ambassador departs, Horemheb explains his reasoning to junior officers observing the meeting. Every time we deploy troops to solve other people's problems, we weaken our own readiness and create dependency that makes those states less capable of defending themselves. Better to maintain credible threat of intervention while encouraging allies to develop their own strength. That way, our empire remains strong through networks of capable partners rather than exhausted Egyptian garrisons scattered across territories too vast to control directly. It's strategic thinking that recognizes military power has limits, and that sustainable empires run on more than just force. The evening brings the social dimension of military command that civilian observers often miss. Horemheb hosts dinner for his senior officers, and while the conversation stays officially light, discussing hunting, families, sports, everyone present understands the real purpose involves maintaining unit cohesion and identifying potential problems before they become crises. You notice that Horemheb pays particular attention to one captain who seems withdrawn, and later you learn he's been gently questioning whether personal problems are affecting the officer's performance and whether command changes might be necessary. It's personnel management, requiring psychological insight and delicate handling, because embarrassing officers publicly can destroy morale, while ignoring problems allows them to metastasize into disasters. During dinner, conversation turns to politics, specifically concerns about succession given the current pharaoh's age and health. Several officers express worry about potential instability if the succession isn't clear, and you watch Horemheb carefully navigate this dangerous topic. He affirms loyalty to the current pharaoh while acknowledging legitimate concerns, emphasizes the military's duty to maintain stability regardless of who sits on the throne, and subtly reminds everyone that soldiers who involve themselves in succession politics often end up dead or exiled when their chosen candidate loses. It's not exactly neutral. Horemheb has his own preferences and ambitions, but it's careful enough to avoid committing to any faction while maintaining the option to act decisively if circumstances require military intervention. Later, alone in his quarters, Horemheb reviews intelligence reports from border garrisons, diplomatic correspondence from foreign contacts, and internal assessments of military readiness. You realize he's maintaining a personal information network that operates parallel to official channels, gathering intelligence that helps him understand situations more completely than sanitized reports provide. Every successful general does this, builds networks of informants, maintains communication with contacts throughout the military and government, stays aware of political currents that might suddenly require rapid response. It's intelligence work as much as military command, and generals who neglect this dimension often find themselves outmaneuvered by rivals who recognize that peacetime power flows through information and relationships as much as through battlefield prowess. As you prepare to leave, Horemheb offers observation that captures the strange world of peacetime military command. In war, I knew my purpose and my enemy. Orders were clear, success was measurable, and soldiers understood why we fought. In peace, everything becomes ambiguous. My purpose is preventing wars that might never happen. My enemies might be internal rather than external. Success means nothing dramatic occurs, and soldiers question why they train for battles that never come. It's harder than combat in many ways, because combat is simple even when it's terrifying, while peace requires navigating complexity that can destroy careers as effectively as any military defeat. He says this without self-pity, merely stating facts that every peacetime commander eventually learns, that the palace's political machinery can be more dangerous than foreign armies, and that survival requires skills having little to do with the military training that earned him his position in the first place. You're walking through the royal children's wing at dawn, where young princes and princesses are already awake despite the early hour, because their education begins before the sun fully rises and continues until evening with intensity that would exhaust most adults. The children range from toddlers just learning to walk to teenagers approaching adulthood, and every single one carries the weight of divine heritage that separates them permanently from normal human experience. They'll never know what it feels like to be anonymous, to make mistakes without political consequences, to choose their own futures or even their own friends without every relationship being filtered through calculations about power, succession, and dynasty. Your guide today is Neferur, teenage daughter of Hatshepsut, who occupies the strange position of being royal, but probably never destined for the throne due to her gender, though her mother's eventual rule as female pharaoh demonstrates that even this assumption can be shattered by circumstances and determination. Nephra moves through the royal quarters with practiced grace, acknowledging servants who bow deeply, ignoring guards who watch her constantly, automatically performing the role she's been trained for since birth. Even though, privately, she sometimes wonders what life might be like beyond these palace walls, where her every movement is monitored, choreographed, and politically significant. The youngest children begin their day with physical training, not play exactly, but carefully structured activities designed to build strength, coordination, and the physical presence expected of royalty. You watch a 5-year-old prince practice walking with the distinctive gait pharaohs use during ceremonies, his small body already learning to move with measured dignity rather than childish enthusiasm. His tutor corrects his posture repeatedly, and the boy complies without complaint because he's already internalized that his body isn't entirely his own, but belongs to Egypt, to the dynasty, to the divine image that royalty must project constantly. It's sad in ways the child can't yet articulate, this loss of ordinary childhood replaced by constant training for a role he didn't choose but must perform perfectly, or face consequences ranging from embarrassment to political disaster. Older children receive academic education that would challenge adult scholars in other societies. By age 10, royal children are expected to read and write both hieroglyphic and hieratic scripts, understand mathematics sufficient for managing estates and understanding economic reports, know Egyptian history back through multiple dynasties, speak at least one foreign language for diplomatic purposes, understand religious theology well enough to perform ritual roles, and possess general knowledge about geography, astronomy, medicine, law, and governance. It's comprehensive education reflecting the reality that royal children might suddenly need to rule, marry foreign kings and represent Egyptian interests abroad, manage temple estates, or serve in high administrative positions where ignorance could prove catastrophic. Nephra's own education included all this plus additional training in areas her mother considered essential. She learned architecture from Senenmut. Do you remember him? Studied military strategy with generals, observed court proceedings to understand law, and spent time with the vizier learning administrative procedures. Hatshepsut was preparing her daughter for possibilities beyond the traditional roles assigned to royal women, though whether Neferu appreciates this opportunity or resents the additional pressure varies depending on her mood and the day's particular frustrations. This morning's lessons focus on diplomacy, and you sit in on a session where royal children practice composing correspondence with foreign rulers. The exercise seems straightforward. Write a letter congratulating a neighbouring king on his military victory, but the tutor dissects every word choice, every phrase, every subtle implication. Too much praise suggests weakness and excessive deference. Too little seems insulting and dismissive. The letter must acknowledge the victory while subtly reminding the recipient of Egypt's superior power, express friendship while maintaining appropriate distance, and include religious references that demonstrate cultural sophistication without accidentally offending foreign gods whose worship differs from Egyptian practices. It takes the students over an hour to compose 3 paragraphs that satisfy the tutor's exacting standards, and you realize that royal correspondence is miniature battlefield where every word carries strategic weight. Egyptian princes who eventually become pharaohs or marry into foreign dynasties will spend decades writing such letters, and mistakes can trigger diplomatic incidents, military conflicts, or political embarrassments that damage Egypt's reputation and their own credibility. The training seems excessive until you understand that it's literally preparing children for situations where their words might determine whether kingdoms maintain peace or descend into warfare. Historians still argue about whether ancient Egyptian childhood was fundamentally different from modern childhood, or whether core experiences of growing up remain constant across cultures and millennia. The evidence suggests both. Royal Egyptian children experienced unique pressures from their divine heritage, political significance, and elaborate training. But they also experienced universal aspects of childhood, like forming friendships, testing boundaries with authority figures, and gradually developing adult identities. The palace tried to control and channel these universal experiences into politically useful directions, but children possess remarkable ability to create normal social dynamics even within the most abnormal circumstances. At midday, the children eat together in a dining hall that would seem relaxed except for the servants tasting every dish before the royal children eat, the guards stationed at every entrance, and the subtle but constant supervision ensuring that no child chokes, falls ill, or experiences accidents that might prove politically inconvenient or genuinely tragic. The meal itself is simple by palace standards: bread, vegetables, fish, fruit, beer watered down for children, because the palace believes that excessive luxury weakens character, while moderate comfort maintains health without creating the soft decadence that supposedly destroyed previous dynasties. Conversation during the meal reveals the social hierarchies that naturally develop among royal children. Some princes swagger with confidence that they're destined for greatness, their mothers being powerful wives, or their birth order suggesting succession possibilities. Others are quieter, already understanding that they're probably destined for secondary roles as officials, priests, or provincial governors, rather than wearing the double crown themselves. The princesses navigate their own complex social terrain where attractiveness, intelligence, and their mother's status all factor into calculations about which foreign king they might eventually marry, or which Egyptian noble might receive them as wives in politically advantageous matches. Neferu points out a young prince sitting alone, a sad-looking boy whose mother fell from favour after angering the pharaoh somehow. The exact transgression lost in palace gossip and rumour. The child's status is now ambiguous. He's still royal, still receives education and comfortable living conditions, but everyone understands his chances of advancement have effectively vanished. He might eventually receive a minor administrative position or a priesthood in some provincial temple, living comfortably but anonymously, while his half-brothers potentially rule empires. It's not cruel by ancient standards. He's not been executed or exiled, but it's a kind of living death for someone raised expecting greatness, and you watch him eating mechanically while carefully avoiding eye contact with peers who once treated him as equal, but now subtly distance themselves from his tainted status. The afternoon brings specialized training based on each child's apparent aptitude and political trajectory. Princes showing military interest work with weapons instructors, practicing with child-sized bows, wooden swords, and spears while learning the basic combat skills that pharaohs must possess, even if they never personally fight in battle. Other princes showing scholarly inclinations spend afternoons with scribes, copying texts and learning the administrative skills that translate into effective governance. Princesses receive training in managing households, understanding textile production, overseeing servants, and the social skills necessary for queens who must host diplomatic receptions, manage palace intrigues, and maintain dignity while navigating situations where their official powerlessness contradicts their practical influence. Neferu's own afternoon involves architectural review with Sen and Mut. She's learned enough to understand construction principles and can intelligently discuss design choices, structural integrity, and aesthetic considerations. Whether this knowledge serves any practical purpose depends on her future, which remains uncertain. If she marries a foreign king, architectural knowledge probably won't matter much. If she remains in Egypt and manages temple estates, it could prove extremely useful. The palace hedges its bets, providing education broad enough that royal children can adapt to whichever roles political circumstances eventually assign them. As evening approaches and lessons finally end, the children have brief free time before dinner and evening rituals. You watch them playing senet, telling stories, engaging in the closest thing to normal recreation their lives allow. Even this free time is supervised, monitored, and subtly structured to prevent inappropriate behaviours or dangerous friendships. Royal children can't form attachments with commoners, can't roam the palace freely, can't experience the unsupervised exploration that helps most children develop independence and identity. Everything is managed, directed, and carefully controlled in service of producing adults who can function effectively in roles that normal childhoods wouldn't prepare them for adequately. Before leaving Neferu for the evening, you ask whether she's happy, and she considers the question seriously before answering. I don't know what happiness means in the way you're asking. I have purpose, education, comfort, and the knowledge that my life matters to Egypt's future. That's not nothing. But sometimes I watch servants' children playing in the courtyards, and I feel something I don't have words for. Not exactly envy, but awareness that they possess freedom I'll never know, that their mistakes are private while mine are political, that they can become whoever they choose while I must become whoever Egypt needs me to be. She says this without self-pity, simply stating facts about royal childhood that she's learned to accept because rejection isn't possible. You can't resign from being born royal any more than you can choose your parents or your divine heritage. You're assigned a role at birth, and the palace spends your entire childhood ensuring you can perform that role perfectly, regardless of whether it aligns with who you might have become if circumstances had been different, and you'd been born into the anonymity that most people take for granted but that royal children can never experience. You're standing in the palace kitchens before dawn, watching the food tasters begin their dangerous daily routine. The air already carries the smell of baking bread and brewing beer, and dozens of kitchen workers move through practiced choreography, preparing meals for the pharaoh and his household. But before any food reaches royal lips, it must pass through the bodies of men like Kenti, a professional taster who's survived 7 years in a position that kills most occupants within 5 through poison, illness, or the accumulated toll of consuming questionable substances. His face shows the perpetual anxiety of someone gambling his life multiple times daily, on the assumption that conspirators won't accept collateral casualties when targeting the pharaoh, an assumption he knows is optimistic but clings to anyway because the alternative is paralyzing terror. Kenti's morning begins with bread tasting. Simple in theory, but requiring careful attention, because poison can be baked into loaves, hidden in the grain before milling, or applied to finished products by anyone in the long chain from field to table. He tears off a piece, examines it for discoloration or unusual texture, smells it carefully, then chews slowly while monitoring his body for any immediate reactions. Nothing happens, which means either the bread is safe or the poison is slow-acting, and distinguishing between these possibilities requires experience, luck, and the grim understanding that some poisons produce symptoms only after sufficient accumulation makes treatment impossible. You watch him repeat this process for beer, vegetables, fish, dates, and every other item that will appear on the pharaoh's breakfast table. Between tastings, he drinks water and waits several minutes, giving fast-acting poisons time to manifest, while his assistant monitors for symptoms: sweating, dizziness, nausea, confusion, trembling, or the dozen other signs that something consumed was toxic. It's scientific method applied to survival, systematic observation under conditions where failed experiments prove fatal. The palace maintains detailed records of poisoning attempts, symptoms, and outcomes, creating an informal toxicology database that helps tasters identify threats more quickly than trial and error alone would allow. But records only help with known poisons, and clever assassins constantly develop new combinations, new delivery methods, new ways to disguise deadly substances as harmless food. Kenty has survived this long partly through skill, and partly through an almost supernatural caution that borders on paranoia. He trusts no one completely, questions everything, and maintains personal relationships with kitchen workers who might warn him if they notice anything suspicious. It's exhausting vigilance requiring constant alertness that leaves him jumpy, insomniac, and probably heading toward an early death from stress-related illness, even if poison never gets him. The historical record documents numerous royal poisoning attempts across Egyptian history, some successful, others thwarted by alert tasters or sheer luck. The threat isn't paranoid fantasy, but genuine occupational hazard for anyone whose death would benefit political conspirators, and food represents the most accessible assassination method. Pharaohs can surround themselves with loyal guards, can sleep in secured chambers, can limit their movements to controlled environments, but they must eat, and every meal represents vulnerability that determined conspirators might exploit if given opportunity. Around midday, you follow Kenty and his assistant to the pharaoh's chambers where lunch service is prepared. The actual tasting occurs in an antechamber, never in the royal presence, because watching someone test your food for poison undermines the divine image pharaohs must maintain. The taster's existence is necessary reality that everyone acknowledges privately but never discusses publicly, because acknowledging that the divine king needs protection from poisoning suggests his divinity isn't protection enough, uncomfortable theological implications that the palace prefers to avoid. Today's lunch includes an imported delicacy, figs from Syria, a gift from a foreign ally. Kenty's caution immediately intensifies. Foreign gifts represent heightened risk because they've passed through less controlled supply chains, where tampering is easier, and because foreign powers might use gifts as assassination vectors disguised as diplomatic generosity. He examines the figs carefully, looking for injection marks, unusual discoloration, or suspicious residue before cautiously tasting one and settling in to wait for reactions. 20 minutes pass in tense silence before he approves the figs as apparently safe, and you realize that every exotic food, every foreign luxury, every item outside normal supply chains carries this additional scrutiny and delay. Historians still argue about how effective ancient food tasting actually was a security measure. Some poisons produce symptoms quickly enough that alert tasters could save royal lives by identifying threats before pharaohs consumed fatal doses. But other poisons work slowly, accumulating over time or producing delayed symptoms that make identification nearly impossible. And truly sophisticated conspirators might target tasters first, conditioning them to accept certain flavors or symptoms as normal before introducing the actual deadly dose. The system provided real protection but certainly not perfect security, and several pharaohs definitely died from poisoning despite elaborate precautions. The afternoon brings different duty, accompanying the pharaoh during public appearances, not to taste food during these events, but to observe, assess threats, and coordinate with guards who provide physical security while tasters manage chemical threats. You follow Kenti through a temple ceremony where the pharaoh receives offerings from priests, and you notice how his eyes constantly scan the crowd, track anyone approaching too closely, note potential threats ranging from obvious to paranoid. It's protection work requiring entirely different skills than food tasting, crowd assessment, threat recognition, coordination with security personnel who might resent a taster's authority, or appreciate an extra set of alert eyes depending on personalities and politics. Being a taster means existing in a strange social limbo. The position is technically prestigious. You're protecting the pharaoh's life, working in intimate proximity to divine authority, receiving compensation that exceeds what most Egyptians earn. But it's also deeply stigmatized because everyone knows you're essentially human sacrifice, a disposable shield positioned between the pharaoh and harm. Other palace workers treat tasters with uncomfortable mixture of respect and pity, maintaining polite distance as though poison might be contagious, or as though befriending someone likely to die soon is emotionally unwise investment. Kenti has developed coping mechanisms that help him survive psychologically if not physically. He maintains detailed personal records of everything he tastes, creating documentation that might help identify patterns if he does get poisoned. He practices meditation techniques learned from priests, calming his mind before each tasting to reduce stress that clouds judgment. He's trained a successor, his younger brother recruited into the profession, not despite its dangers, but because family loyalty makes betrayal less likely, and because someone must continue the work when Kenti inevitably dies. It's grim family business, passing expertise in avoiding death to relatives who will need that expertise for the same reason you needed it, because the pharaoh requires protection, and someone must provide it regardless of personal cost. Evening brings the day's most dangerous meal, dinner prepared after hours when kitchen workers are tired, when supervision might be lax, when conspirators could exploit reduced vigilance. Kenti approaches this final tasting session with renewed caution, examining each dish even more carefully than morning and midday tastings. He's survived 7 years partly by recognizing that routine breeds complacency, and that the moment he relaxes is probably when something goes wrong. So he maintains intensity through exhaustion, inspecting the evening bread with the same thorough attention he gave this morning's despite having already tasted bread multiple times today without incident. You watch him taste the pharaoh's wine, an especially dangerous item because wine's natural complexity can disguise poisonous additives more easily than simpler foods. He swirls it, smells it, takes a small sip and holds it in his mouth before swallowing and waiting. 5 minutes pass, 10, 15. Only after 20 minutes without symptoms does he approve the wine, and even then he instructs that it be served from the specific jar he tested, rather than any other, because consistency is crucial, and switching jars could introduce untested containers where poison might lurk. After completing the evening tasting, Kenti returns to his quarters, simple rooms near the kitchen, where he can be quickly summoned if needed during the night. You notice he keeps medicinal supplies handy, emetics for inducing vomiting if he suspects poisoning, antidotes for known toxins, pain remedies for the chronic stomach issues that plague most long-term tasters whose digestive systems suffer accumulated damage from consuming marginal food and occasional low-dose poisons that produce symptoms but not death. His body is simultaneously his most valuable asset, and the tool being systematically destroyed by his profession, and he's grimly aware that even if poison never kills him, the accumulated toll probably means he won't live to old age. Before you leave him for the night, Kenty shares the philosophy that keeps him functioning despite impossible pressure. Every morning I wake knowing today might be my last. That should be terrifying, but I've learned it's actually liberating. When death is constantly possible, you stop worrying about minor problems and focus on what actually matters. Doing your job well, treating people decently, finding small pleasures in days you're fortunate enough to survive. Most people spend their lives avoiding thoughts of mortality. I don't have that luxury, which means I'm forced to accept reality that everyone faces but most ignore until it's too late. The Pharaoh's food might kill me tomorrow, but fear of death won't kill me today, because I decided years ago that I'd rather die doing dangerous work well than live safely doing nothing that matters. It's brave philosophy, or perhaps just the rationalization necessary to survive psychologically in an impossible position. Either way, Kenty settles in for a few hours of fitful sleep before tomorrow's dawn brings another day of systematically risking his life so that the divine Pharaoh can eat breakfast without fear. Though whether that fear is truly eliminated or merely transferred from one person to another is a question neither of them can afford to examine too closely, when the alternative is acknowledging that security is always incomplete and that no amount of caution can eliminate every threat in a world where ambition, hatred, and desperation motivate countless people to risk everything for the slim chance of changing Egypt's future by ending its pharaoh's life. You're in the palace reception hall watching a Nubian diplomat named Meherpri navigate the treacherous waters of foreign service in the Egyptian court, and immediately you sense the additional layer of complexity his foreignness adds to already complicated political dynamics. Meherpri serves as advisor on Nubian affairs, translator for southern delegations, and informal representative of interest from territories that are simultaneously conquered provinces, trading partners, and sources of gold, soldiers, and exotic goods that Egypt craves. His skin is darker than most Egyptians. His accent carries traces of languages spoken beyond the cataracts, and despite his obvious competence and the pharaoh's genuine reliance on his expertise, he'll never fully escape the invisible barriers that mark him as perpetually other in a society that views Egyptian identity as inherently superior to foreign alternatives. The morning begins with translation work. A delegation from Kush has arrived seeking reduction in tribute requirements, arguing that recent droughts have damaged harvests and that demanding full payment would cause genuine hardship. Meherpri must translate their petition while simultaneously navigating several impossible demands. Remain faithful to what the Kushite speakers actually say, but frame arguments in ways that resonate with Egyptian officials who might dismiss foreign complaints as manipulation or weakness. Represent Nubian interests honestly, but not so aggressively that Egyptian authorities question his loyalty to the pharaoh. Demonstrate his value as cultural intermediary, but never appear to be forming a separate power base that could threaten palace stability. You watch him perform this delicate dance, translating the Kushite leader's passionate speech into measured Egyptian formal language that preserves the core arguments while removing elements that might offend. When the Kushite speaker references his people's long history of independence before Egyptian conquest, Meherpri softens this to the ancient traditions of the southern territories, avoiding language that challenges Egypt's claim to legitimate authority. When describing current hardships, he includes sufficient detail to make the case compelling, but avoids dramatic descriptions that might make Egyptian officials dismiss the petition as theatrical exaggeration. its translation as editorial curation, shaping communication to maximize chances of favorable outcomes while maintaining plausible faithfulness to original intent. After the Cushites depart to await the pharaoh's decision, Maherpri provides private counsel to Egyptian officials about the petition's validity. This is where his real value emerges. He can assess whether the drought claims are genuine or exaggerated, can estimate how much tribute reduction is actually necessary versus how much the Cushites are hoping to gain through negotiation, can predict whether denying the petition might trigger resistance or rebellion that would cost Egypt more than the foregone tribute revenue. Egyptian officials lack this contextual knowledge and must rely on foreign advisors like Maherpri to help them navigate situations where incomplete information could lead to catastrophically bad decisions. But this reliance creates profound discomfort for Egyptian officials who prefer believing they possess inherent superiority that makes foreign advice unnecessary. You notice how some officials direct questions to Maherpri while avoiding eye contact, how they acknowledge his expertise while carefully maintaining social distance that reinforces hierarchy, how they accept his recommendations but frame them as their own insights when reporting upward to higher authorities. It's systematic erasure dressed as normal bureaucratic practice, and Maherpri navigates it with practiced patience because challenging these dynamics openly would end his career immediately, while accepting them preserves his ability to influence policy in ways that benefit both Egypt and the foreign populations whose interest he informally represents. Historians still argue about how multicultural ancient Egypt actually was compared to its reputation as an insular civilization obsessed with ethnic purity and cultural superiority. The archaeological and textual evidence reveals complexity. Egypt definitely conquered and incorporated foreign territories, employed foreign soldiers and officials, traded extensively with neighboring regions, and absorbed foreign influences in art, religion, and technology. But it also maintained strong ideology of Egyptian exceptionalism, referred to foreigners using terms that translate roughly as barbarians, and created visual propaganda showing the pharaoh triumphantly smiting foreign enemies in ways that communicated clear messages about ethnic hierarchy. Around midday, Maherpri meets with other foreign officials serving in various palace capacities, a Libyan military officer, an Asian merchant coordinating trade missions, a Mitanni princess who married into Egyptian nobility and now serves as diplomatic liaison with her homeland. These gatherings are technically social, but they serve crucial function of creating informal networks where foreign officials can share information, coordinate responses to Egyptian policies, and provide mutual support while navigating a court that simultaneously needs their expertise and resents their presence. The conversation flows between multiple languages, and you realize that these foreigners are often more cosmopolitan and multilingual than their Egyptian counterparts, a competence advantage that doesn't translate into social status, but provides practical capabilities that Egypt increasingly requires as its empire expands. The Libyan officer describes recent tensions with Egyptian commanders who question his loyalty despite years of faithful service, and Maherpri nods with understanding that comes from shared experience. "They want our skills but not our advancement," he observes quietly. "We can advise but never command in our own right. We can translate but must allow Egyptians to claim credit for insights we provide. We can succeed but only within invisible boundaries that shift based on politics we can't fully predict or control. It's exhausting performance of perpetual gratitude for opportunities that citizens receive as birthright. It's accurate assessment of foreigners' position in Egyptian society, useful but not trusted, valued but not equal, necessary but never quite legitimate. Some foreign officials eventually become so assimilated that their origins are nearly forgotten, their children or grandchildren fully Egyptian in identity and social acceptance. Others remain permanently marked as foreign regardless of how long they serve or how completely they adopt Egyptian culture. The distinction seems to depend on factors including ethnic background, physical appearance, social connections, and perhaps simple luck in avoiding situations where their foreignness becomes politically convenient scapegoating opportunity. The afternoon brings exposure to casual xenophobia that foreign officials endure constantly. During a palace meeting about security concerns, an Egyptian official suggests that foreign influences might be corrupting traditional values and that perhaps Egypt should limit opportunities for non-Egyptians to serve in sensitive positions. The argument is presented as reasonable security policy rather than ethnic prejudice, and several officials nod agreement while carefully not looking at Maya Pri and the handful of other foreign advisors present. No one directly challenges the statement because doing so would create confrontation that serves no one's interests, so it hangs in the air like poison gas slowly dispersing but leaving residue that everyone breathes. After the meeting, Maya Pri returns to his office, and you notice his shoulders sag with exhaustion that's emotional rather than physical. 20 years I've served Egypt faithfully, he says to no one in particular. 20 years of providing expertise they couldn't obtain elsewhere, of never betraying confidences, of proving my value repeatedly. And still I'm foreign influence when convenient, still subject to suspicion that citizens never face, still required to demonstrate loyalty that others receive as assumed entitlement. He says this without particular anger, just weary acceptance of realities that won't change regardless of his individual merit or accomplishments. Yet despite these frustrations, Maya Pri continues serving because the alternatives are worse. Returning to Nubia would mean abandoning the status, wealth, and connections he's built over decades. Seeking service elsewhere would mean starting over in unfamiliar territory with no guarantee of better treatment. And there's genuine satisfaction in the work itself. He shapes policies affecting thousands of people, helps prevent misunderstandings that could escalate into violence, facilitates commerce and cultural exchange that benefits multiple societies. The personal slights and professional limitations sting, certainly, but they don't erase the meaningful impact his work creates despite the constraints under which he operates. As evening approaches, Maya Pri dresses for a palace banquet, where he'll perform another of his unofficial duties, being visibly foreign in ways that demonstrate Egypt's cosmopolitan sophistication and imperial reach. The pharaoh likes having foreign officials present at diplomatic events, showing visiting dignitaries that Egypt successfully incorporates diverse peoples into its administration. It's performance of multiculturalism that's more symbolic than substantive, but Maya Pri participates because refusing would be career suicide and because even symbolic representation has value when the alternative is complete invisibility. At the banquet, you watch him navigate social dynamics with the same careful skill he brings to professional translation work. He's friendly, but not too familiar, competent but not threatening, foreign enough to be interesting but Egyptian enough to be acceptable. He entertains guests with stories about Nubian customs, carefully selected to seem exotic without appearing barbaric, and accepts compliments about how civilized he's become with gracious humility that conceals whatever he actually thinks about the implicit insult buried in such praise. It's exhausting emotional labor that citizens never perform because their belonging is assumed rather than constantly negotiated through careful performance. Late in the evening, a drunken noble makes a crude joke about foreigners that's supposedly humorous but carries genuine malice beneath the laughter. Myherpri smiles politely, neither endorsing nor challenging the comment, because either response would create problems worse than enduring momentary discomfort. After the noble moves away, the Mitanni princess who heard the exchange catches Myherpri's eye, and they share a look of perfect mutual understanding. The silent communication between people who recognize shared experience of navigating spaces where they're simultaneously welcomed and excluded, valued and diminished, necessary and resented in measures that shift constantly but never fully resolve into simple acceptance or rejection. You leave Myherpri as the banquet winds down, and walking back through palace corridors now quiet after the day's activities, you reflect on how Egypt's empire depends on foreign expertise it simultaneously mistrusts, how its administration requires multicultural competence while maintaining ideologies of ethnic superiority, and how individual foreigners like Myherpri perform daily miracles of patience and skill while operating under constraints that would break less determined people. The pharaoh's throne sits atop a system that's more diverse than propaganda admits, but less inclusive than necessity requires, and the gap between these realities creates permanent tension that foreign officials must navigate because Egypt needs them too much to exclude them completely, but trusts them too little to embrace them fully as equals in the civilization they serve, with competence that often exceeds their citizens' capabilities but never earns them complete belonging in the society where they've dedicated their lives. You're in the royal workshops where artists, sculptors and craftsmen create the visual propaganda that will define this pharaoh's reign for eternity, and immediately you sense the tension between creative impulses and rigid constraints that makes palace art simultaneously magnificent and frustrating for the people who produce it. Master sculptor Thutmose, who will eventually create the famous bust of Nefertiti, though that's still in his future, is reviewing sketches for a new temple relief showing the pharaoh receiving tribute from conquered peoples, and every line, every gesture, every proportion must conform to artistic conventions established centuries ago and enforced with religious fervour. Because deviation from tradition isn't seen as creativity, but as dangerous corruption that threatens cosmic order itself. The workshop smells of stone dust, paint pigments, and the particular mustiness of papyrus sketches accumulated over generations. Apprentices sit in corners copying classic works, training their hands to reproduce the canonical forms that every Egyptian artist must master before being allowed to work on royal commissions. There's little room here for individual style or personal expression. Egyptian art values consistency, clarity, and adherence to established visual language over innovation or experimentation. An artist's skill is measured not by originality, but by how perfectly they can execute traditional forms, how seamlessly their work blends with pieces created by artists who died centuries ago, how completely they can subsume personal vision into collective aesthetic that's remained remarkably stable across Egypt's long history. Thutmose examines a young sculptor's preliminary work on a pharaoh's portrait statue, and his critique reveals the exacting standards governing royal imagery. The shoulders are too narrow. They must be broader to convey strength even if the actual pharaoh is slender. The face is too individual. Smooth away those distinctive features and create the idealized countenance that represents divine kingship rather than mortal appearance. This stance is too relaxed. Royal figures must display formal dignity, weight distributed evenly, the body positioned in eternal stillness rather than suggesting movement or casual naturalism. The young sculptor accepts these corrections without argument, because he understands that royal art serves political and religious functions that override aesthetic considerations. The pharaoh in temple reliefs and statuary isn't meant to look like the actual human being wearing the crown, but rather to embody the eternal concept of kingship. Always young, always powerful, always triumphant over enemies and favoured by gods. Whether the real pharaoh is old, weak, or facing political difficulties becomes irrelevant in art that creates idolised reality more true than mundane facts could ever be. You watch the workshop produce several pieces simultaneously: a massive stone statue destined for a temple entrance, delicate jewellery incorporating carnelian and lapis lazuli from distant trade routes, painted tomb decorations showing idealised scenes of afterlife prosperity, and ceremonial furniture inlaid with precious metals and exotic woods. Each piece requires specialised skills, and the workshop functions like a small factory where different craftsmen contribute to collective output under Thutmose's overall artistic direction. It's collaborative rather than individual creativity, with master artists controlling overall vision, while numerous hands execute specific components according to established techniques and standards. Historians still argue about whether Egyptian art's conservatism reflected genuine religious conviction or practical calculation about maintaining social stability through visual continuity. The artistic tradition certainly served important functions. It created instant recognizability across generations, communicated political messages through universally understood visual vocabulary, and reinforced social order by depicting hierarchies and relationships in consistent, unambiguous ways. But it also stifled innovation, made artistic progress nearly impossible, and created situations where talented artists couldn't fully deploy their skills because tradition demanded they suppress individual creativity in favour of collective conformity. Around midday, a crisis emerges that illustrates the political dangers embedded in palace art. A relief panel showing the pharaoh's recent military campaign has been completed and installed in a temple complex, but someone has pointed out that one of the defeated enemies is depicted with features resembling a currently allied foreign king. Whether this was intentional political statement, careless mistake, or simply unfortunate coincidence doesn't matter. The diplomatic implications are severe, and the pharaoh is reportedly furious that art commissioned to glorify his victories might instead create international incident requiring awkward explanations and possibly expensive diplomatic gifts to smooth over. Thutmose must investigate immediately, determine responsibility, and decide whether the panel can be modified or must be completely redone despite the enormous expense and wasted labour. You follow him to the temple where he examines the controversial relief carefully, comparing the carved features against reference sketches and trying to determine whether the resemblance is close enough to constitute genuine problem or whether hypersensitive officials are seeing implications that ordinary viewers wouldn't notice. It's artistic judgment tangled with political calculation, and his conclusion will determine whether sculptors face punishment, whether the project suffers expensive delays, and whether his own reputation as master artist survives this potential scandal. After careful examination, Thutmose decides the resemblance is superficial, and that subtle modifications, changing the headdress, adjusting facial proportions slightly, will eliminate the diplomatic concern without requiring complete rework. It's compromise solution that minimises damage while acknowledging the legitimate concern, and he personally supervises the modifications to ensure they're executed properly. Crisis averted, though the incident leaves everyone nervous about future projects where unintended political messages might lurk in artwork that hundreds of people examine for meanings ranging from obvious to paranoid. The afternoon brings more pleasant work, creating decorative elements for the royal palace that can incorporate more creativity than religious art allows. A painted frieze showing marshland scenes with birds, fish, and papyrus plants offers opportunities for naturalistic observation that temple reliefs forbid. Thutmose encourages his painters to study actual birds rather than merely copying traditional forms, and you see his own artistic instincts emerging in this less constrained context, where beauty and accuracy matter more than theological correctness. Watching him work reveals genuine artistic talent that conventional assignments only partially utilize. He observes how light plays across a bird's feathers, how water ripples around swimming fish, how plants bend in wind. Attention to natural detail that never appears in formal Pharaoh portraits where everything is static, idealized, and stripped of the messy vitality that characterizes actual life. In these decorative pieces, Thutmose can exercise skills that official commissions suppress, and you sense his satisfaction in creating art that's beautiful rather than merely functionally propagandistic. Yet even here, constraints exist. The colour palette is limited to pigments available from natural sources, red and yellow from ochre, blue from ground lapis lazuli, green from malachite, black from charcoal, white from limestone or gypsum. Some colours are extremely expensive, and Treasury officials scrutinise usage to prevent waste of precious materials on non-essential decoration. Composition must follow principles of balance, symmetry, and hierarchical scaling, where important figures appear larger than less important ones regardless of realistic perspective. And ultimately, even decorative art serves the palace by creating beautiful environments that reinforce the pharaoh's prestige and Egypt's cultural sophistication. As evening approaches, Thutmose reviews the day's production, approving some pieces for continued work while rejecting others that don't meet his standards. You notice he's harder on his own work than on his assistants, constantly refining his own pieces while accepting slightly lower quality from students still learning the craft. It's professional integrity combined with realistic understanding that not everyone can achieve master-level execution, and that demanding perfection from apprentices would paralyze production without corresponding improvement in output quality. Before ending the workday, Thutmose spends time teaching, gathering apprentices to discuss principles underlying the day's corrections and decisions. Our art serves eternity, he tells them, which means every piece we create must be worthy of lasting forever. But serving eternity also means subordinating personal ego to tradition, understanding that our individual contributions matter less than maintaining the continuous visual language that makes Egyptian art immediately recognizable across centuries. You may dream of creating something revolutionary, something entirely new that establishes your personal legacy. Forget those dreams. Your legacy is contributing skillfully to collective achievement that will outlast any individual name or innovation. It's artistic philosophy that modern sensibilities find almost incomprehensible, the deliberate suppression of individuality and innovation in favour of tradition and continuity. But in Egyptian context, it makes profound sense. The art isn't meant to express artists' feelings or advance aesthetic movements, but to serve religious, political, and social functions requiring consistency and clarity more than novelty. Personal artistic vision is almost irrelevant compared to the work's function in maintaining Ma'at, that cosmic order that obsesses Egyptians more than creative self-expression ever could. You watch apprentices absorb this lesson with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some clearly accept it completely, grateful to join a tradition larger than themselves, while others seem to struggle with the constraints even as they understand the reasoning behind them. One young painter asks almost plaintively whether there's any space for new ideas, any possibility of advancing Egyptian art rather than merely perpetuating it. and Thutmose considers the question seriously before responding. Sometimes, he says slowly, very rarely, circumstances create opportunities for careful innovation. When a new pharaoh wants to distinguish his reign, when foreign influences introduce techniques we can adapt without violating core principles, when problems arise requiring creative solutions within traditional frameworks. These moments are precious but dangerous. Innovate successfully, and you might be remembered as the artist who expanded Egyptian visual vocabulary while maintaining its essence. Fail, and you're the fool who broke sacred traditions and brought chaos into what should have been order. Most artists wisely avoid the risk, and most times that's the right choice. But occasionally, for reasons I don't fully understand myself, the risk feels worth taking despite the danger. He says this while running his hands over the Nefertiti bust he's been working on privately. A portrait that will eventually revolutionize Egyptian royal imagery through its unprecedented naturalism and psychological depth, while still maintaining enough traditional elements to remain recognizably Egyptian. Whether he knows he's creating masterpiece or simply experimenting with techniques he hasn't fully committed to remains unclear, but you recognize that in this workshop, beneath the surface of conservative tradition and careful adherence to established forms, creative impulses struggle constantly against constraints, sometimes producing transcendent work precisely because of rather than despite the limitations that force artists to achieve brilliance within boundaries that make innovation desperately difficult but occasionally magnificent when successfully accomplished. You're standing outside the pharaoh's private chambers in the early hours of morning when everything changes. The king has died unexpectedly in his sleep, and suddenly the palace machinery that usually hums with predictable routine lurches into chaotic scrambling as factions realize that succession is unclear, that competing claims will emerge, and that the next few days will determine Egypt's future for decades to come. The official announcement hasn't been made yet. Guards are preventing anyone from entering or leaving certain palace sections, and in the corridors you can already feel the temperature shifting as officials, priests, military commanders, and royal family members begin calculating their positions in the power struggle that's about to erupt into something between careful negotiation and outright civil war, depending on how the next hours unfold. The immediate problem is that the pharaoh died without clearly designating an heir. He had several sons from different wives, and while one seemed favoured, nothing was formalized through the proper ceremonies and pronouncements that would make succession automatic. Now, multiple princes have legitimate claims, each backed by different constituencies. One has the support of powerful priests, another is favoured by military commanders, a third is the eldest son by birth order, though his mother fell from favour years ago. The vizier, do you remember Regmir, is frantically trying to organise an orderly process for resolving this situation before the competing factions start mobilising forces and turning political disagreement into violent conflict. You watch as messengers are dispatched with carefully worded notifications to provincial governors, garrison commanders, temple administrators, and foreign allies, messages that acknowledge the pharaoh's death, while deliberately avoiding any commitment to succession outcomes until the situation in the palace stabilizes. The wording is crucial because premature recognition of one claimant by powerful officials could trigger cascading commitments that lock Egypt into choices made hastily rather than wisely, while excessive delay creates power vacuum that ambitious actors might exploit through force rather than negotiation. The harem, where you visited with Tie, has become a battlefield of whispered conspiracies and frantic negotiations. Mothers of potential heirs are calling in every favour, activating every relationship they've cultivated over years, and making promises they may or may not be able to keep if their sons succeed. Tia's son is one of the contenders, and you see her moving through the women's quarters with intensity that contrasts sharply with the strategic invisibility she previously maintained. This is her moment. Success means her son becomes Pharaoh, and she becomes the most powerful woman in Egypt as Queen Mother, while failure might mean exile, imprisonment, or worse, depending on how vindictive the successful faction feels toward rivals who oppose them. The priests are conducting emergency consultations with the gods through oracles and divination, ostensibly seeking divine guidance about succession, but practically positioning themselves to legitimize whichever candidate offers the best terms for temple interests. You watch Hapusenaib, the high priest you met before, carefully navigate between competing claims, maintaining neutrality while subtly communicating to all sides that priestly support is available but not free. Whoever wants divine endorsement will need to guarantee temple privileges, fund construction projects, and respect the priesthood's political autonomy in ways that recent pharaohs occasionally challenge to the clergy's profound displeasure. Military officers are the wild card in this situation. Horemheb controls significant forces and could theoretically impose a succession choice through military power, but that would set dangerous precedent of generals crowning kings and would likely trigger resistance from officials and priests who reject military rule. More likely, the military will support whichever candidate emerges from civilian negotiations, while ensuring that their support comes with guarantees about military funding, autonomy, and command appointments. You notice that garrison commanders near the capital are being instructed to remain in heightened readiness, not to intervene in succession directly, but to prevent any external actors from exploiting Egypt's internal distraction, or to suppress any civil unrest that might emerge if succession disputes escalate into violence. Historians still argue about how succession crises were resolved in ancient Egypt. The official records naturally present every transition as smooth and divinely ordained, but evidence suggests that many successions involved intense political struggle, occasional violence, and outcomes that reflected power balances as much as legitimate claims. Some transitions were genuinely smooth, when pharaohs clearly designated heirs and major factions agreed on outcomes. Others produced extended conflicts, rival claimants setting up competing courts, and sometimes brief civil wars that ended only when one faction decisively defeated its rivals and then retroactively created propaganda presenting their victory as inevitable fulfillment of divine will. By midday, the major factions are emerging clearly. Tia's son has secured support from several key officials and the treasurer, who calculates that this prince offers the best chance of competent governance and fiscal stability. A second prince has military backing and the support of Nubian auxiliaries whose commanders believe he'll pursue aggressive foreign policy that creates advancement opportunities for soldiers. A third prince, eldest by birth, has traditional legitimacy and support from conservative priests who believe birth order should determine succession regardless of other considerations. Each faction is strong enough to make their candidate viable, but not strong enough to guarantee success, which means negotiation becomes essential, even as each group prepares for the possibility that negotiations fail, and force becomes the ultimate arbiter. The vizier convenes an emergency council including representatives from all major factions, and you watch this remarkable meeting where Egypt's power brokers must simultaneously compete and cooperate, advocating for their candidates while also working toward an outcome everyone can accept, rather than triggering civil war that would damage Egypt regardless of who ultimately wins. The discussion is remarkably frank, Everyone acknowledges the competing claims, the political considerations, and the need to resolve the situation quickly before uncertainty erodes confidence in Egypt's stability and encourages foreign enemies to test the kingdom's defences while it's distracted by internal politics. One proposal emerges that might satisfy multiple constituencies. The military-backed prince becomes pharaoh, but he marries the eldest prince's sister to legitimize his claim through royal bloodlines, and he appoints the third prince to a powerful position like high priest or governor of Upper Egypt, creating a coalition government that distributes power among the major factions, rather than concentrating it entirely with the winning claimant. It's compromise that requires everyone to accept partial satisfaction rather than total victory, but it has the enormous advantage of preventing civil war and maintaining Egypt's stability during the dangerous transition period, when rivals could easily tear the kingdom apart through their competition. But Ti's son isn't included in this arrangement, which means Tia faces devastating failure after coming so close to supreme power. You watch her receive this news with remarkable composure, accepting defeat gracefully rather than creating scenes that would only make her situation worse. She immediately begins negotiating terms for her son's future. He'll be appointed to a respectable but not powerful position, will receive estates sufficient to support comfortable lifestyle, and will publicly endorse the succession compromise in exchange for guarantees that he won't be persecuted or eliminated as potential rival to the new pharaoh. It's pragmatic survival replacing impossible ambition, and T demonstrates the same political intelligence that kept her alive in the harem for years, knowing when to fight and when to accept outcomes she cannot change. The evening brings the formal announcement. The military-backed prince will be crowned pharaoh after completing the proper rituals and ceremonies that legitimize his rule. The proclamation emphasizes divine selection, continuity with tradition, and unanimous support from officials, priests, and military commanders, carefully erasing the messy political negotiations that actually determine the outcome. Within hours, scribes are already writing official histories that will present this succession as smooth, inevitable, and divinely ordained, while the actual uncertainty, competing factions, and backroom negotiations disappear from the record because admitting that succession involved human political struggle rather than divine determination would undermine the entire theological framework justifying pharaonic authority. You watch as officials who backed losing candidates scramble to demonstrate loyalty to the new pharaoh, offering congratulations, pledging support, and desperately hoping that their previous opposition won't be held against them in the new reign. Some will successfully transition and continue their careers under the new administration. Others will be quietly sidelined, gradually losing influence and positions until they are effectively exiled from power, even if they remain physically present in the palace. A few might face more dramatic consequences if the new pharaoh decides that eliminating rivals is necessary for securing his position, though wholesale purges are relatively rare in Egyptian history because they tend to create more instability than they resolve. The priests are already planning the coronation ceremonies that will transform a prince with contested claims into a legitimate pharaoh through ritual processes that literally recreate divine kingship. The elaborate ceremonies serve practical political purposes beyond their religious significance. They create public spectacle that demonstrates the new pharaoh's authority. They provide time for opposition to emerge if any major faction refuses to accept the succession, and they create formal transition point where loyalty transfers from the deceased pharaoh to his successor in ways that the entire society can witness and acknowledge. As night falls, and the palace begins settling into exhausted calm after the day's frantic maneuvering, You reflect on how the succession crisis revealed power dynamics usually hidden beneath the facade of divine authority and eternal stability. The Pharaoh's throne appears unshakable from outside, but behind it are humans competing for power using tools ranging from religious authority to military force to careful political negotiation. The system usually works to channel these competitions into manageable processes that preserve stability, but every succession represents a moment when the machinery could fail catastrophically if the various factions can't reach acceptable compromises, or if someone decides that violence offers better chances than negotiation. You walk through the palace corridors, now quiet after the crisis has passed into resolution, and you notice that life is already returning to normal routines. Guards resuming regular patrols, servants preparing tomorrow's meals, officials organizing their priorities for the new reign. Egypt's resilience comes partly from this ability to survive transitions without complete disruption, to maintain continuity even as individual pharaohs come and go. The specific person on the throne matters, certainly, but the throne itself and the massive administrative machinery supporting it possess their own momentum that persists through changes in leadership. Behind every pharaoh stands an apparatus of scribes, priests, officials, soldiers, and workers whose daily routines sustain the kingdom regardless of which individual happens to wear the double crown and embody divine authority that is simultaneously very real and carefully constructed through human effort that never stops, never fully rests, and somehow maintains Egypt's stability across centuries of individual rulers whose reigns mark time but don't fundamentally disrupt the eternal rhythm. You're walking through the palace in the quiet hour between sunset and full darkness, months after the succession crisis resolved, and what strikes you most powerfully now is how quickly everything returned to its eternal rhythm. The same rituals performed at the same times, the same reports flowing through the same channels, the same officials occupying the same roles they held under the previous pharaoh, as though the dramatic uncertainty and frantic negotiations never happened. The new pharaoh sits on the throne, but the machinery behind that throne operates with continuity that transcends any individual ruler, and you realize this continuity is Egypt's greatest achievement, and perhaps its most unappreciated miracle. The ability to maintain complex systems across generations, across crises, across changes that would destroy less resilient civilizations. The morning rituals begin as they always have. Priests awakening the gods in temple sanctuaries throughout Egypt, scribes arriving at their posts before dawn to begin the day's documentation, officials reviewing overnight reports from provincial administrators who never sleep because governance requires constant attention. You follow the familiar paths through administrative corridors where you've walked before with the vizier, the treasurer, the military commander, and you recognize faces you've seen throughout this journey. Some older now, some replaced by successors performing identical functions. But the roles themselves unchanged, because the palace doesn't operate on personalities, but on positions that individuals temporarily occupy before passing them to the next generation of officials who will perform the same duties with the same tools using the same procedures, refined across centuries. In the Hall of Records, elderly scribes are training their replacements, passing down knowledge about filing systems, documentation standards, and institutional memory that exists nowhere except in human minds that must transfer their contents to younger minds before death erases what isn't successfully transmitted. You watch a senior scribe explaining to a student how to locate documents from 40 years ago, navigating through pottery jars and papyrus rolls, organized according to systems that seem chaotic to outsiders, but follow perfect internal logic once you understand the principles that created them. The system is older than any person currently living, the teacher explains, and it will survive long after we're both dead. Your job isn't to change it, but to understand it so completely that you can teach it to the next generation, maintaining continuity that makes Egypt's governance possible across time spans that exceed individual human comprehension. The treasury vaults still hold Egypt's wealth, though specific gold bars and grain sacks have been replaced countless times while the institution itself remains constant. Amenemhab's successor, his nephew, trained in the same careful methods, performs the same inventory verifications, makes the same impossible calculations balancing competing demands, and carries the same anxiety about accountability that treasurers have shouldered for dynasties. The faces change, but the function persists, and you realize that institutional continuity depends less on specific individuals' brilliance than on systems robust enough that competent people can operate them successfully even when they're not geniuses, even when they make occasional mistakes, even when circumstances become difficult and require adaptation within frameworks that remain fundamentally stable. In the harem, new wives have joined the royal household while older women age into different roles. Queen mothers wielding influence through their adult sons, elderly concubines retired into comfortable irrelevance, young princesses beginning the same education and experiencing the same strange childhood that Neferure described to you. The building is the same, the routines are identical, but the specific women occupying these roles have changed, demonstrating how the institution of the royal harem transcends individuals who pass through it, serving the dynasty's continuity regardless of which particular women happen to be raising the current generation of royal children who will eventually produce the next generation in endless succession that outlasts every individual life while maintaining collective identity across centuries. Historians still argue about what made Egypt so remarkably stable compared to other ancient civilizations that rose and fell within shorter time spans. Was it geography? The Nile's reliable flooding creating agricultural surplus that funded complex government? Was it ideology? The concept of Mayat providing philosophical framework for maintaining order? Was it simply luck and circumstances that happened to align favourably? The answer is probably all these factors combined with the institutional design that you've been observing throughout this journey. Systems that don't depend on exceptional individuals, that build redundancy and verification into critical processes, that balance competing powers against each other, preventing any single faction from dominating completely, and that prioritize continuity and stability over innovation and change. The temples continue their eternal cycle of rituals that have been performed the same way for so long that no one remembers when they started or why specific gestures and words were originally chosen. The priests currently officiating will die and be replaced by priests who perform identical ceremonies, and those priests will be replaced in turn, and the chain extends backward into mythical past and forward into unknowable future, with each generation's contribution being not to create something new, but to maintain what was inherited and pass it forward intact to successors who will do the same. It's conservative in the extreme, but it's also profoundly stabilizing in ways that innovative, rapidly changing societies can never achieve, because they're constantly disrupting themselves, constantly rebuilding foundations that never fully solidify before the next round of changes arrives. In the royal workshops, new apprentices are learning the same artistic techniques that Thutmose learned and that his teachers learned before him, copying the same canonical forms that have defined Egyptian art for dynasties. Individual artists occasionally introduce subtle innovations, a slightly more naturalistic treatment here, a new compositional approach there. But these changes are absorbed into tradition so gradually that the overall aesthetic remains remarkably consistent across centuries. Future archaeologists will be able to identify Egyptian art instantly, even when they can't date specific pieces precisely, because the visual language maintains its essential character even as it slowly evolves, demonstrating how continuity and gradual change can coexist when systems are designed to incorporate innovation carefully rather than embracing disruption enthusiastically. The military garrison continues its peacetime routines under new commanders who enforce the same discipline, conduct the same training, and navigate the same tensions between military and civilian authority that Horemheb managed. Soldiers retire and are replaced by new recruits who learn the same skills and absorb the same professional culture, maintaining institutional knowledge about tactics, logistics, and command structures that don't need to be reinvented each generation, because they're embedded in training systems, unit traditions, and the collective memory of professional military class that views itself as continuous brotherhood, extending across time rather than collection of disconnected individuals who happen to be soldiers simultaneously. As full darkness settles over the palace and you make your final walk through spaces that have become familiar over this long journey behind the Pharaoh's throne, you pass the kitchen where tomorrow's bread is already being prepared, the guard posts where soldiers are changing shifts according to schedules established generations ago, the private chambers where the new Pharaoh is probably reviewing documents by lamplight, just as his predecessor did and as his successor will do after him. The specific person occupying that role matters. Competent pharaohs govern more effectively than incompetent ones, and individual decisions have real consequences. But the role itself and the massive supporting structure that makes pharaonic rule possible persist regardless of individual competence, because the system is designed for sustainability rather than dependence on exceptional individuals who inevitably die, leaving gaps that must be filled by whoever comes next. You think back over everyone you've met on this journey. The vizier making impossible decisions under crushing pressure. The scribes controlling information that translates into power. The harem women playing long-term political games with their children's futures. The priests whispering to gods while managing vast economic enterprises. The physician gambling his life on imperfect medical knowledge. The architect building for eternity while managing temporal construction crises. The treasurer balancing Egypt's wealth against infinite demands. The general navigating peacetime politics more dangerous than warfare. The royal children being shaped into tools serving dynasty rather than developing as individuals. The food taster accepting daily death risk. The foreign advisor providing expertise while never fully belonging. The artist creating eternal beauty within rigid constraints. And the countless officials whose crisis management prevented succession disaster and maintained stability when everything could have collapsed into chaos. Each of these people is simultaneously important and replaceable. Important because they're performing essential functions right now with skills and dedication that matter enormously. But replaceable because the positions they occupy will continue after they're gone, filled by successors who will face similar challenges and deploy similar skills in service of the same eternal machinery. It's simultaneously humbling and inspiring, recognizing that individual significance exists within larger contexts that transcend any single life, and that the greatest human achievement might not be creating something revolutionary, but rather maintaining something valuable across generations, preserving and passing forward what was inherited from ancestors to descendants in chains that extend beyond any individual's comprehension, but that collectively create civilizations lasting longer than anyone involved in their daily operation can fully grasp. The palace is settling into night now. Most officials departed to homes and families, though essential functions continue because governance never completely stops. Guards remain alert. Emergency officials stay available for crises that might emerge, and the machinery hums quietly through darkness. Before dawn brings another day of identical routines performed by people who understand that their individual contributions matter precisely because they're a part of something larger than themselves. Something that was ancient when they were born and will be ancient still when they die. Something that their great-grandchildren will serve in turn, maintaining Egypt's eternal rhythm that is the civilization's truest accomplishment. Not the pyramids or temples, impressive as those are, but the intangible persistence of organized human cooperation that built those monuments and that continues building, maintaining, adapting, surviving across centuries that blur into millennia, while the machinery behind the pharaoh's throne keeps functioning because individuals keep choosing to make it function, keep performing their roles competently enough that the whole never quite breaks, despite constant pressure that would destroy anything less carefully designed for exactly this purpose. Endurance, continuity, and the preservation of order against the chaos that always threatens but somehow never quite prevails, as long as someone, somewhere, keeps the ancient rhythms going for one more day, one more year, one more generation in the endless succession that is Egypt's gift to history, and perhaps its deepest wisdom, that permanence is possible when humans commit to something larger than themselves, and maintain it with dedication that transcends individual glory. And so you find yourself walking away from the palace now, leaving behind its corridors and chambers and the countless people who will wake tomorrow to perform their duties once again, in rhythms that have continued for so long they seem almost like natural laws rather than human choices. These stars are brilliant above the desert, and the Nile flows as it always has, and somewhere in the darkness priests are chanting prayers that were old when their grandparents were young. You feel the weight lifting from your shoulders, the tension easing from your mind as you move away from the palace's intensity into quiet night air that carries the scent of water and warm stone. The people you've met will continue their work without you, their lives unfolding in patterns both predictable and surprising, their individual dramas playing out within larger structures that contain and shape them. But you've seen enough now to understand how it all fits together, how the machinery operates, how Egypt maintains itself through the dedicated work of people who mostly remain anonymous, but whose collective effort creates something remarkable and enduring. Let that knowledge settle gently into your mind as sleep approaches. Let the images blur and soften. Let the details fade into impressions and the impressions into peaceful darkness. The palace stands through the night as it has stood through countless nights, and it will stand tomorrow when the sun rises and the rituals begin again, and it will stand years from now when different people occupy the same roles, and centuries from now when archaeologists will uncover these stones and wonder about the lives lived here. But for now, for tonight, you can rest, can release the complexity and intensity, can simply drift into sleep knowing that you've witnessed something true and important about how humans organize themselves and maintain civilization across time, and that knowledge can accompany you gently into dreams where pharaohs still rule, and gods still walk among mortals, and the eternal machinery still hums behind the throne. But softly now, distantly, like a lullaby sung in an ancient language you don't quite understand, but that somehow soothes you, nonetheless as you drift deeper into rest, deeper into peace, letting go of everything you've carried and seen and learned, letting it all recede into comfortable distance until there's only darkness and quiet, and the gentle rhythm of your breathing as you finally peacefully sleep.